Keep her. The mafia boss's wife left quietly after discovering his affair, taking the one thing he could never replace. He didn't even look up when she walked in. Matteo Vescari was laughing, his hand resting on the small of another woman's back, fingers moving slow and familiar, like he owned her the way he owned everything else. The penthouse was full of people, music, expensive smoke, and the sound of men who had never been told no. Vivienne stood in the doorway of her own home and watched her husband of 7 years pull that woman closer and whisper something that made her laugh. It was a quiet laugh. Private. The kind Vivienne used to get. She didn't make a sound. She turned around, walked back down the hall, sat on the edge of the bed they shared and stared at the floor for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. She counted. Then she stood up, opened the bottom drawer of her wardrobe, lifted the false panel beneath the winter scarves, and took out the black case. She already knew what was inside. She'd been the one who kept it safe. One suitcase, the black case, the elevator down, the street. That was all. If you've ever had to decide in the space of a single breath whether to fight for someone who stopped fighting for you, then you already know exactly where Vivienne Cross was standing that night. Don't go anywhere. If this story already has you gripping something, hit that like button right now. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. And drop a comment below telling me the city and country where you're watching from, because I want to see how far this story travels. Stay with me. Every part of this is worth it. The party had started at 9. By midnight, the penthouse at Vescari Tower smelled like bourbon and imported cigars, and the particular kind of masculine satisfaction that comes from men who believe the world owes them everything it's already given them. There were maybe 40 people in that space. Lawyers, city officials with careful eyes, 3 men who ran territory on the eastern waterfront, 2 women who were there because Matteo liked a room that looked a certain way. Music from somewhere, low enough to talk over, loud enough to blur the edges of whatever was being said. Vivienne had been at the far end of the main room, in conversation with Greta Summers, the wife of one of Matteo's finance attorneys. Greta was talking about a trip to Portugal. Vivienne was nodding at the right moments, her glass of sparkling water untouched, watching the room the way she always watched rooms, cataloging exits, measuring temperatures, reading the posture of every person who might eventually become a problem. It was a habit she'd built over 7 years. Matteo thought it was charm. It wasn't charm. It was survival. She noticed the woman because of where she was standing. There was a geography to Matteo's gatherings that he'd never explained to anyone, but that everyone in his orbit understood implicitly. Certain people stood by the bar because that's where the conversation was loose and low stakes. Certain people clustered near the windows because power liked to look at what it owned. And certain people, only certain people, were allowed within 3 feet of Matteo Vescari himself when he was in a social mood. That radius was territory. Everyone in his world knew it. The woman was inside it. She was wearing a dark green dress, something tailored and understated, the kind of thing that said money without announcing it. She had dark hair pulled back at the neck, and she was turned toward Matteo with her whole body, not just her face, and Matteo had his hand on her lower back. Not a greeting touch, not the kind of thing you did when you were being polite. His hand was resting there, settled, comfortable. Vivienne stopped listening to Greta mid-sentence. She told herself it was nothing. She had told herself a lot of things were nothing over the years. She was good at it. She set her water glass down on a side table without looking at it, excused herself in the middle of Greta's story about Lisbon, and walked toward the hallway that led to the bedroom wing. She needed a moment. That was all. A moment to breathe and remember who she was, and remind herself that she was not the kind of woman who made scenes at parties. She was at the hallway entrance when she heard it. Matteo's voice, low, meant only for one person, and then the woman's laugh, and then silence of a particular kind, the kind that had shape to it. Vivienne turned back. She stood in the open doorway between the hall and the main room, and she watched Matteo Vescari pull that woman, her name, she would learn later, was Lena Marek, against his side with the ease of someone who had done it many times before. He said something with his mouth close to her ear. She laughed again, and her hand came up and rested flat against his chest, and Matteo looked down at her with an expression Vivienne recognized the way you recognize a song that was written for you before someone else started singing it. She had seen that look directed at herself once, a long time ago. She stood there for exactly as long as it took her to understand what she was seeing, not to accept it, acceptance would take longer, but to understand it, the mechanics of it, the duration of it implied in the ease of how they moved together. The way neither of them looked around to see who was watching, because in some part of Mateo's mind, no one who mattered was there. Then she turned around and walked to the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was Italian, custom, cost more than most people's cars. The sheets were changed every 2 days by staff she'd hired, vetted, and quietly trained to be invisible. The room smelled faintly of Mateo's cologne because it always did, because everything in this apartment bore some trace of him, because that was what happened when you spent 7 years organizing your life around a man's preferences. She counted the floor tiles. She didn't cry. She had learned early in this marriage that crying in this space felt like losing something, and she was done losing things tonight. 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Then she stood up. She went to the wardrobe. She pulled open the bottom drawer, cashmere, wool, things folded the way the housekeeper folded them, precise and soft. She lifted the scarves and pressed the false panel at the back of the drawer, the one the contractor had installed 4 years ago on her instruction, the one Mateo didn't know about because Mateo had never had reason to look there. The black case was exactly where she'd left it. She sat with it in her lap for a moment. It was not large, roughly the size of a hardcover book, maybe 1.5 inches thick, combination lock on the front face. She knew the combination. She was the one who had set it. Inside were 47 pages of handwritten entries in a code she had spent 8 months developing herself, cross-referenced against a set of accounts Mateo didn't know she had access to. The ledger. Not a digital copy. Not a backup. The original. She put it on the bed. Then she went to the closet and pulled out the medium-sized suitcase, the one she kept half-packed out of a habit she had never examined too closely and never discussed with anyone. She added to it quickly and without drama. 4 changes of clothes, her personal documents in the zippered interior pocket, the burner phone taped to the inside of a shoebox on the high shelf, a stack of folded bills from the emergency envelope in the back of her jewelry case, and the small silver photograph in its leather frame that sat on her nightstand. The photograph was of no one Mateo had ever met. She zipped the suitcase. She picked up the black case. She left her wedding ring on the nightstand. She didn't think about it. She just did it the way you do things when some part of you has been planning them for longer than you've let yourself admit. The hallway was quiet. The party sounds were muted from here, bass through walls, muffled laughter. She passed the second guest bathroom, past the room that had been designated as a home office, but that Mateo used mainly to store things he didn't want the staff touching, past the framed photograph of the Manhattan skyline that Mateo had hung there because someone told him it looked powerful. She pressed the elevator button. She waited 22 seconds. She rode down 41 floors in complete silence. She walked out the lobby onto 57th Street and turned left and kept walking until she reached the parking structure on the corner where she had, 8 months ago, registered a vehicle under a name connected to one of her older family accounts. She got in. She drove north. She didn't look back at the tower. In the apartment behind her, the party continued until nearly 4 in the morning. Matteo Viscari didn't notice she was gone until 9:15 the following day, when he found her ring on the nightstand and the bottom drawer of her wardrobe standing open. By then, Vivienne Cross had been gone for 7 hours. The thing about Matteo Viscari was that he had never once, in his adult life, been left. He had left. He had dismissed. He had ended things with a single word or a look or simply by redirecting his attention elsewhere. And the people on the receiving end of that had understood quickly that they were not to argue the point. But no one left Matteo. It was not something that happened in his world, because in his world, walking away from Matteo Viscari was not a personal decision. It was a geopolitical event. He stood in his bedroom on the morning of October 14th and looked at the ring for a long time. It was a 7-carat cushion-cut diamond in a platinum setting that he had personally selected at a private jewelry consultation because he had wanted her to have the best, and he had wanted to be the one who chose it. He'd slid it onto her finger at their wedding in front of 200 people who were afraid of him, and she had looked at him like she was the only one in the room who wasn't. He had liked that more than he'd expected to. He picked the ring up, set it down. He called her cell phone. Straight to voicemail. Not a delayed ring, straight to voicemail, which meant the phone was either off or discarded. He called again. Same. He went to his office and opened his laptop and pulled up the account monitoring software linked to their shared accounts. She hadn't touched them. He pulled up the secondary program his security team used to track registered vehicles associated with the household. Her car, the Range Rover she drove in the city, was parked in its spot in the building's private garage. It had not moved. He sat back. She had left in something else, which meant she had planned to leave in something else, which meant she had a vehicle he didn't know about, which meant she had planned this. He picked up his phone and called Ronan Vale. Ronan was his oldest lieutenant, his closest advisor, the man who had been at his right hand since before Matteo had consolidated the family's territory into what it had become. They had grown up adjacent to each other, not friends exactly, because Matteo didn't use that word loosely, but bound by proximity and shared history in the way that matters more than friendship in most cases. Ronan answered on the second ring. Morning. Vivienne's gone. A pause. Measured. Gone how? Left. Last night, sometime during the party. I need you to start looking. Another pause, slightly longer. I'll get Carver on it. Don't use Carver. Do it yourself. And Ronan? He stopped. She took something from the apartment. I need to know what she took before anyone else finds out she's missing. He hung up before Ronan could ask what the something was. Matteo went back to the bedroom. He opened the bottom drawer of Vivienne's wardrobe. He saw the displaced scarves, the false panel standing open, and he went completely still. He had not known about the compartment. He had not known there was a false panel in any drawer in this apartment. He had lived here for 6 years, and he had never had reason to search his own wardrobe because why would he search his own wardrobe? He pressed his palm against the empty space where the panel opened out. Nothing left inside. She had cleared it. He straightened up slowly. The ledger. He had kept his own copy, naturally. He had 4 copies of the ledger in different secure locations. But Vivienne's copy, the original, the one written in her hand, in her code, because she had insisted on maintaining it herself years ago, when the volume of information became difficult to track digitally without risk. That copy was the one he had never thought to worry about. Because she was his wife. Because the ledger had been her idea. Because he had trusted her with it, the way you trust the person who knows everything about you when you haven't yet considered that trust is something that can expire. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He sat where she had sat, although he didn't know that. He looked at the floor. He was not a man who panicked, but something was happening in his chest that he did not have an immediate name for. And it was not about the ledger, or not entirely about the ledger. And that bothered him more than the ledger did. His phone rang. He looked at the screen, expecting Ronan. It was his attorney, Marcus Heald. That was unusual. Marcus did not call on Sunday mornings. He answered. We have a problem, Marcus said, and his voice had the careful flatness of a man delivering news he wishes he didn't have. Tell me. I received a message this morning from a legal firm I'm not familiar with, regarding it's a formal separation of financial interest filing. She moved overnight, Matteo. The filing is already in the system. Matteo didn't speak for a moment. She has representation, Marcus continued. Senior representation. Firm out of D.C. I don't know how she retained them without you knowing, but they have a full financial disclosure package attached to the filing, and they're citing a brief pause, paper shuffling, breach of marital covenant, intentional concealment of assets, and something else. They're flagging a set of account numbers I need you to explain to me. The account numbers. Which accounts? Marcus read 3 of them. Matteo's jaw tightened. Those accounts were not in any document he had shared with Vivienne. Those were accounts that passed through a holding company, nested 3 layers deep in a corporate structure that his own finance people barely had full visibility into. Where did she get those numbers? I don't know, Marcus said. But Matteo, if those accounts are what I think they are, stop talking on this line. He stood. Come in. 40 minutes. He ended the call. He stood in the center of the bedroom and looked around at the space she had shaped, the furniture she had chosen, the art on the walls that she had sourced, the particular way the room was organized that reflected her preferences more than his, because he had never cared much about rooms and she had cared about everything. He had lived inside the life she had built around him for 7 years without once considering how much of it was hers. He picked up the wedding ring from the nightstand. He looked at it. Then he put it in his pocket and went to meet his attorney. Vivienne Cross had not been born into money, which meant she had learned very young that the only assets that couldn't be taken from you were the ones no one knew you had. Her mother had been the third daughter of a New England family that had lost its fortune in a business collapse before Vivienne was born. Not publicly, not dramatically, but quietly and completely, the way ruin sometimes happens when people are too proud to admit it early enough. Her father had been a trade attorney with a mind like a steel filing system and a tendency towards silence that most people mistook for coldness. It was not coldness, it was precision. He had given Vivienne two things: his ability to read contracts and his instinct for where information lived. She had married Matteo Vescari at 31, which people in his world had considered slightly old to be a first marriage for someone who looked like her. She hadn't cared what they considered. She had met him at a gallery event. He was there because a piece he'd commissioned was being shown alongside legitimate art, which was a kind of money laundering she found almost admirable in its brazenness. She had told him that. He had laughed in a way that made her think he hadn't been caught off guard in years. They had been married 14 months later. She had known what he was. She had never pretended otherwise to herself or to him. She had made that clear in the first year, that she understood the shape of his world and would not pretend to be naive about it, but that she would not be complicit in anything she couldn't live with, and that if he expected her to be decorative, he had married the wrong woman. He had looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Good." And she had understood that to mean he had wanted a partner, not a prop. For 5 years, that's what they'd been. She had learned the business, not as a participant, but as an architect. She had restructured 3 of his holding companies to reduce exposure. She had identified 2 men in his inner circle who were skimming before his own accountants caught it. She had built the ledger system because she had recognized, watching him, that the volume of information he carried in his head was a liability. One serious concussion, one bad night, and the institutional knowledge of the entire enterprise would become inaccessible. So she had built a record-keeping system that was encrypted, handwritten, and stored in her code. And Matteo had approved it because he trusted her and because it was a good idea. She had told herself for a long time that the copy she kept was insurance against chaos. She had understood, somewhere around year 4, that it was also insurance against him. She was now in a house in Connecticut. It was not a house anyone would look for her in. It was registered to a charitable foundation she had established 3 years ago under a maiden name variation, Cross Farrell, her mother's hyphenate, and used intermittently as a meeting space for the foundation's board. The staff knew her as the foundation director. They did not know anything else. The house had a clean phone line, a pantry she had kept stocked on a rotation, and a room on the 2nd floor with a desk and a filing cabinet and a window that looked out over a low-traffic road. She arrived just before 5 in the morning. She made coffee. She sat at the desk. She opened the black case. The ledger inside was handwritten in the encoding system she had developed, a modified substitution cipher combined with a reference numbering system that required a separate key document to interpret, and that key document was not in the case. It was in a safety deposit box in Providence. She had chosen Providence because Matteo had no active connections there and had not visited the city in 5 years. She was not ready to use the ledger. She was not even sure yet what she intended to do with it, beyond the fact that she had taken it because it was hers. She had built it, she had maintained it, and leaving it behind felt like leaving the last evidence that she had existed in that marriage as a person with agency rather than as a fixture. She sat with her coffee and looked at the first page. 7 years. 47 pages. The architecture of a life she had helped build and had spent the last year and a half very quietly preparing to leave. Not because she had known about Lena Marek, not specifically, but because she had felt the shift in Matteo's attention the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not with her mind, with her body. The way animals feel weather. She turned to the page. Her phone, the burner, not her personal cell, which she had left in the apartment's bathroom cabinet, battery still in, buzzed once. She looked at it. A text from a number she recognized. 3 words. He's already looking. She set this phone face down. She already knew that. She had planned for that. She had given herself a 72-hour window before his search would become sophisticated enough to threaten the layers she'd set up. And inside that window, she had 3 moves to make. The first one was already in motion. Marcus Heald would have the legal filing by now. She picked up the desk phone and dialed. A woman answered on the second ring. Carrington Group. It's me, Vivienne said. We've been waiting, the woman said. He's going to push back on the financial disclosures. I know, let him. We have documentation on the accounts. He can deny it, but the paper trail exists. I want the filing public by Tuesday. That's aggressive. I know. Vivienne, I know what I'm doing, Helen. She paused. How's your team holding up? We're fine. It's your end I'm worried about. She looked out the window at the dark road, the birch trees along the shoulder barely visible. I'm fine, she said. She hung up. She was not entirely fine. She was a woman who had spent 7 years inside the orbit of a man she had loved, still loved, if she was honest with herself, which she tried to be in private even when she couldn't afford to be in public. And she was now on the outside of that orbit, in a house in Connecticut, with 47 pages of encoded intelligence that could collapse a criminal empire if she chose to use them. She hadn't decided yet what she would choose. She poured the rest of her coffee down the sink, rinsed the cup, and went upstairs to try to sleep. She managed about 3 hours. On Monday morning, 3 things happened simultaneously in Matteo Vescari's world that should not have happened simultaneously. The first was a raid on a distribution warehouse in the Bronx, not by federal agents, which would have been expected and manageable, but by a rival crew out of Brooklyn that should not have known the warehouse existed. That location had been dark for 11 months. The only record of its continued operational use was in the ledger. The second was a call from a city councilman, a man who had been in Matteo's pocket for 4 years, who suddenly had concerns about a zoning approval that had already been signed. He was not threatening to reverse it. He was simply communicating, with careful political language, that he was under pressure from somewhere and that the arrangement might need to be revisited. He hung up quickly. People only hung up quickly on Matteo when someone else had gotten to them first. The third was a message delivered through an intermediary, not digital, not by phone, but physically, through a man who drove a white panel van and met Ronan Vale in a parking structure in Midtown. The message was short. It said, "The wife knows more than you told him she knew. You should have moved faster." Ronan Vale read the message twice. Then he burned it. Then he went to see Matteo. He found him in the operations room of the family's main compound, a converted commercial space in a building in the West 30s that served on its surface as a shipping logistics firm. Matteo was standing at the center table looking at a map of the Bronx with Carver and 2 other men. He looked up when Ronan came in, and the look he gave Ronan was the particular look that meant Matteo was holding himself very still, because otherwise he would not be. "The warehouse," Matteo said. "I know," Ronan said. "I'm working it." "They knew it was there, Ronan. That location is not in any digital file, it's not on any list, it's not in anyone's head, except the 3 people in this building, and whoever she told them. She didn't necessarily—" "Don't." Matteo's voice dropped. It was quieter than his normal register and therefore more dangerous. "Don't explain it away. Someone accessed that information, and it went to the Brooklyn people. The only complete record of that location is in the ledger. She took the ledger. We don't know she used it. We know someone used it." He turned back to the map. "Find her." "I'm working on it. She's good at this, Matteo. Better than—" "I know how good she is." He said it flatly, not angry. Something else. "I know exactly how good she is because I watched her build the system she's now using against me, and I didn't ask enough questions. Find her anyway." Ronan nodded. He left. In the hallway outside, he paused. He stood with his back against the wall for a moment, not quite still, one hand flexing at his side. Then he took out his personal phone, not the work phone, the personal one, and sent a text to a number stored under a woman's name. The text said, "Accelerate. We're running out of time." He put the phone away and walked back to his office. Vivienne had been a careful woman for 7 years. She had learned careful from Matteo, which was the particular irony of her situation. The man she was now protecting herself against had taught her most of what she knew about how to stay invisible. She had not, however, used the ledger. She had not shared a single piece of information from it with anyone. The warehouse raid in the Bronx had nothing to do with her, and she knew it. She had heard about the raid through one of her Connecticut contacts, and had felt, for just a moment, the cold clarity of understanding that something was happening inside Matteo's organization that she had not set in motion, which meant someone else had access to information they shouldn't have had, which meant the ledger was not the only leak. She sat with that for a long time, in the second-floor room with the desk and the window, and she turned the implications over carefully. She knew Mateo's inner circle. She had observed it for years, cataloged its tensions and alignments, the way she cataloged everything. She knew who the loyalists were and who the pragmatists were. And she knew that a Brooklyn crew moving on a dark warehouse location with that kind of precision required either surveillance capability well above their weight class or inside information from someone who had it. She thought about Ronan Vale for the first time in several weeks. She opened the ledger to page 31. The entries there were from 8 months ago, and they detailed a series of account transfers she had flagged as anomalous at the time. Not irregular enough to alarm Mateo, not patterned in any obvious way, but present in a configuration that she had noted and coded and cross-referenced because that was what she did. She had meant to raise it with Mateo. She had not raised it with him, and she had not fully examined why she had held that back, except that the transfers had originated from an account that passed through Ronan's jurisdiction. She looked at the numbers. She looked at the dates. She looked at a particular sequence that she had missed the first time because she had been looking for embezzlement, and this was not embezzlement. This was coordination. These were transfers that didn't accumulate money. They moved it, small increments, in a pattern that corresponded to activity months later. Preparatory movement, like someone setting up the architecture of something before the thing itself was ready to be built. She sat back. She was 38 years old, and she had been married to a man who ruled through fear and loyalty, and she was sitting in a house in Connecticut with a piece of paper that suggested his oldest friend and closest advisor had been quietly building a case against him for at least a year. She thought about the woman in the green dress. She thought about Mateo's hand on that woman's back. She thought about the fact that the affair had been occurring, she estimated, based on the behavioral shifts she had tracked, for at least 14 months. She thought about what it would take to arrange for a man like Mateo to become so distracted by a personal entanglement that his attention moved away from the operational patterns happening around him. She thought about the word arranged. She closed the ledger. She picked up the burner phone and dialed the number for Helen Carrington. "I need a change in the filing strategy," she said when Helen picked up. "Don't touch the financial disclosures. Hold everything. Vivienne, I need 48 hours. There's something I need to understand before we take any further steps." "He's not going to wait 48 hours. His people have already started looking for pressure points." "I know." She stood and moved to the window. The road outside was still quiet. Low morning traffic, a pickup truck moving slowly past the birch trees. "Let them look. And Helen, I need you to run a name for me. Quietly. Not through the usual channels. I need to know everything there is to know about a man named Ronan Vale." A pause. "The lieutenant?" "Yes." Another pause, longer. "Vivienne, if he's involved, then Mateo needs to know," she said. "Before I decide what I'm doing with the ledger, Mateo needs to know." She hadn't expected to say that. She stood with the phone at her ear for a moment after she said it, slightly surprised at herself, and then she pressed her lips together and waited for Helen to respond. "I'll have something for you by tomorrow morning," Helen said finally. "Thank you." She hung up. She stood at the window for a while. She was not softening. She was not going back. She was not forgiving anything. She had not changed her mind about the marriage or the ring she'd left on the nightstand, or the 7 years of a life she had spent building something that turned out to be partly a lie. But she was Vivienne Cross, and Vivienne Cross did not use a weapon she didn't fully understand, and she did not walk away from a man she had loved for 7 years without at least being certain she understood what she was walking away from. The road outside was empty now. She turned from the window and went back to the desk. She opened the ledger again. She started from the beginning. The ledger entries from 8 months ago had a smell to them, if documents could smell, something stale and deliberate, the way a room smells when someone has been in it and tried not to leave a trace but left one anyway. Vivienne sat at the desk until the light through the window changed from gray to pale gold, which meant morning had committed to itself, and she had gone through every page twice. The second time through, she used a pencil and a piece of graph paper to map the account transfer sequences in a simple grid, dates across the top, account identifiers down the side, transfer amounts in the cells. She was not a mathematician. She was something more useful, a woman who understood that patterns were just behavior, and behavior always had a motive underneath it. By 7:15 in the morning, she had the grid complete. She sat back and looked at it. The transfers were not random, and they were not organic, and they were not, as she had initially suspected, Embezzlement. They were something more patient than embezzlement. Someone had been moving money in small increments across a period of 14 months, not accumulating it, not funneling it toward a personal account, but positioning it, setting it in specific places the way you set chess pieces before you've announced you're playing a game. 3 accounts that Vivienne recognized as operational reserves, 2 that fed into a supplier network on the eastern seaboard, 1 that she did not recognize at all, registered to a corporate entity she had never encountered in 7 years of tracking Mateo's finances. She wrote the corporate entity name down on a separate piece of paper. Halcyon Meridian, LLC. She stared at it. It meant nothing to her immediately. But nothing in Mateo's financial architecture was accidental, and an entity she didn't recognize meant an entity that had been deliberately kept from the ledger, which meant someone had made sure she never saw it. She folded the paper and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket. She made more coffee. She stood at the kitchen counter and drank it while watching the driveway, which was empty, which was the only correct state for it to be. She had driven a route with 2 deliberate detours on her way here and had stopped once to check for a tail and found none. She was not naive enough to believe she had 12 hours, let alone 48, before Mateo's people triangulated the Connecticut connection. Not because she'd been careless, but because Mateo had resources she had never fully mapped, and resources that size found things eventually. She needed to be useful before they found her. She went back upstairs. She sat at the desk and called Helen Carrington at 7:42. "You're up early," Helen said. "I need the Halcyon Meridian LLC search added to the Ronan Vale poll, and I need to know if there's any registered connection between the 2. A keyboard in this background. Spell the LLC. She spelled it. "Give me 2 hours," Helen said. "1, Tets." A pause. "I'll do what I can." Vivienne hung up. She opened the ledger again. She went to page 41, which covered a period 6 months ago, and read through it with the grid on the desk beside her. She found 2 more account numbers she hadn't flagged the first time. She added them to the grid. Then she stopped. She stopped because there was a sequence. 3 transfers, 7 days apart, same incremental amount, same destination account, that landed on dates she recognized. Not because she had coded them, because she remembered them. The first date was the night of a dinner at the family compound, a private gathering of senior associates, the kind of event Mateo held twice a year to consolidate loyalty and read the room. Vivienne had attended. She always attended. And on that specific night, she remembered, Ronan Vale had been seated next to Lena Marek. She sat very still. The second date was 2 weeks after that, a charity event Mateo had skipped but that Vivienne had attended alone, and where she had seen Lena Marek across the room speaking with a man she didn't recognize at the time. She had noted it the way she noted everything, filed it away, assigned it no particular significance because at that point she had no reason to assign it significance. The third date was 3 months after that, a Monday. The day after Mateo had come home from a weekend in Miami that she had not been told about until after it happened, which was unusual. Mateo was not generally a man who neglected to inform his wife of his schedule. She had asked, and he had said it was operational, which was not an answer, which she had accepted because she had learned when to push and when not to. That Monday she had been in a particular mood. She remembered the mood now. She had gone for a walk alone in the afternoon, which she rarely did in the city, and she had stood on a bridge over the East River for 20 minutes watching the water. She had known then, not consciously, but the body knows before the mind does. She had known. She closed the ledger. She put her palm flat on the cover and stayed there for a moment. Then she stood up and started making a list. At 9 a.m. On Monday, Matteo Vescari walked into the Midtown offices of Marcus Heald and sat down across from his attorney with the specific kind of stillness that Marcus had learned over 15 years of representing him meant Mateo was operating entirely on control and not on calm. Marcus laid 3 documents on the desk between them. "The separation filing is legitimate," Marcus said. "It's clean, it's thorough, and whoever drafted it knows exactly what they're doing. The DC firm, Carrington Group, they're not a mob firm, they're not a family law firm in the usual sense. They specialize in high-asset dissolutions with international components. They've done 3 major organized crime adjacencies that I know of. They're good." Mateo looked at the documents without touching them. "She retained them before last night. At least 60 days ago, based on the filing date of the preliminary documentation. The filing last night was the activation, not the initiation. Marcus paused. She's been planning this for 2 months minimum. Mateo said nothing. The account numbers flagged in the disclosure. Marcus opened the second document. I need you to tell me what those are. Because if Carrington has documentation on them, and those accounts are what I think they are, we have an exposure problem that goes beyond the divorce filing. They're operational accounts. With what paper trail? Clean paper trail. 3 layers of corporate structure. Mateo. Marcus set down his pen. She has account numbers that she should not have had access to. That means either she found them herself or someone gave them to her. If she found them herself, he stopped. How long has she had access to the ledger system? She built it. She's had access to it for 5 years. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then she's had 5 years to work backwards from the ledger entries to the account structures, which means she didn't need anyone to give her anything. Mateo's voice was level. She built the map, and then she read it. Okay. Marcus took a breath. Then our exposure on the accounts is significant, but not unmanageable if we move quickly. I need you to authorize a restructuring of the 3 flagged entities before the end of business today. We can reposition the assets and sever the paper trail before Carrington files anything further. Do it. And the ledger itself, if she uses it in a proceeding, she won't use it in a proceeding. Mateo stood. That's not what the ledger is for. She knows that better than anyone. Marcus looked at him carefully. Then what is she going to do with it? Mateo didn't answer. He picked up his jacket and left. In the elevator going down, he stood alone and looked at his own reflection in the polished metal doors. He looked older than he had looked 3 days ago. Not by much. Enough. He thought about the morning he had come home from Miami, the Sunday, the one he hadn't told her about in advance. He had expected her to be cool with him, the way she got sometimes. That particular Vivienne coldness that was never theatrical but always unmistakable. Instead, she had been perfectly normal. Dinner was there. She had asked him one question about the trip, a single specific question about a supply arrangement they'd been discussing, and the question was so precisely relevant that it had derailed his anticipation of the cold shoulder, and he'd answered it, and then the evening had moved on. He had been relieved that she hadn't pushed. He understood now that she had not been satisfied. She had been gathering. The elevator doors opened. He walked through the lobby into the street and stood on the sidewalk in the Monday morning midtown noise and felt, for approximately 4 seconds, something he did not have a name for in his professional vocabulary. Not fear, not guilt. Something adjacent to both and belonging to neither. Then his phone rang. Ronan. He answered. We have a location, Ronan said. Mateo's jaw tightened. Where? Connecticut. Fairfield County. A foundation property registered to a charitable entity that traces back to a name variation on her mother's side. It's clean, Mateo. It's very clean. She set this up long before last night. How long before? Registration date on the foundation is 3 years ago. 3 years. He had been married to her for 7, and she had been building an exit infrastructure for 3. He stood with that on the sidewalk and did not let it show on his face, which was a skill he had and used now for the second time in 12 hours against his own interior. Don't send anyone there yet, he said. A pause. Brief. Mateo, I said don't. I want to go myself. That's not a good idea. Ronan. His voice dropped just slightly. When I want your opinion on what's a good idea, I'll ask for it. Have a car ready in 40 minutes. He hung up. He stood there another moment. Then he started walking. Ronan Vale sat in his own office in the compound and looked at his personal phone for a long time after Mateo hung up. He was 61 years old. He had been in this business for 37 of those years, starting as a runner at 24, working his way through roles that would not bear description in polite company, arriving finally at the position he had held for 19 years as the right hand of the Viscari family operation, first under Mateo's father, Ennio, then under Mateo himself after Ennio's stroke 8 years ago had removed him from operational capacity. 19 years. He thought about that number sometimes, the way you think about a number that should mean something, but that you've spent so long inhabiting that it's become furniture. He thought about the 19 years of things he had done for this family, the decisions he had made and carried out and never discussed, the accommodations he had reached with his own sense of himself in service of the family's continuity. He thought about the text he had received from the parking structure. The wife knows more than you told him she knew. You should have moved faster. The message was from a man whose name Ronan had never said aloud to anyone. A man connected to the Brooklyn organization, not the soldiers who had hit the warehouse, not the street level, but the strategic level, the man who made the decisions about which directions to push in and when. A man Ronan had been in contact with for 16 months. 16 months. He had not set out to betray Matteo Viscari. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself, even if clarity was a limited comfort. He had arrived at it gradually, through a series of smaller decisions that each seemed containable at the time, the way a ship takes on water through a sequence of small breaches before the cumulative weight becomes irreversible. The first contact had been opportunistic, a back-channel communication about a territorial dispute that Ronan had resolved without informing Matteo, because Matteo had been distracted with a personal situation and because Ronan had believed genuinely that he could handle it more efficiently than a full family summit would allow. The second contact had been deliberate. By the third, he had been providing information. He had told himself for 16 months that he was not betraying Matteo. He was managing him. I was positioning the organization for a transition that was going to happen one way or another, and it was better managed from inside than imposed from outside. He had told himself that Matteo's increasingly erratic decisions, the Miami trip, the failure to consolidate the Eastern waterfront deal, the growing distraction, were symptoms of a leadership style that had peaked and was now calcifying. He had told himself that what he was doing was a form of loyalty to the organization, even if it wasn't loyalty to the man. He had told himself a lot of things. Now Matteo was driving to Connecticut to talk to his wife, a wife who had apparently been building documentation for 3 years, and the Brooklyn contact was telling him to accelerate, and Ronan was sitting in his office with his personal phone in his hand and the clear, cold understanding that the situation had moved past the point where his management of it was adequate. He typed a reply. He's going to her himself. You need to be ready to move if that conversation goes wrong. He sent it. He put the phone in his desk drawer. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and went out to arrange Matteo's car. The drive from Midtown to Fairfield County was an hour and 40 minutes with Monday traffic. Matteo sat in the back of the car alone. He had dismissed the usual second man and watched the city give way to highway, give way to the kind of Connecticut landscape that money wore quietly, big properties behind tree lines, gates set back from the road. He had called no one during the drive. He had the address from Ronan, a road in a residential agricultural zone, the kind of area where a foundation property would look entirely unremarkable. He had looked at the address for a moment before getting in the car and recognized nothing from it, which was the point. He had known Vivienne was intelligent. He had married her partly for it. But there was a difference between knowing a thing and understanding its full dimension. And he was arriving, at 51 years old, at the specific humiliation of a man who has lived alongside someone's full capability for 7 years without accurately measuring it. He wasn't angry in the way he had expected to be angry. He was something more uncomfortable than anger. He kept returning, without meaning to the image of her in the bottom drawer. Not her specifically, but the false panel. The space behind the panel. The deliberateness of a woman who had prepared for this day long before he had given her reason to. Or had he? He pressed his temple against the cool window glass. He had given her reasons before Lena Marek. He had given her reasons she had never catalogued aloud. The times he had made decisions that excluded her. The times he had dismissed her, read on a situation, and then watched her read prove correct. The times he had brought her to the edge of something honest between them and then pulled back because honesty cost him a vulnerability he was not accustomed to paying. The car turned off the highway. He watched the road. He was not going to beg her. He was not built for begging, and even if he had been, he suspected she wouldn't have respected it. What he was going to do was look at her and say the things he had not said because he had not believed, until this morning, that not saying them would result in this. He had been wrong. He had been wrong in a way that was going to cost him significantly more than his pride, and he understood that, and he was driving toward it anyway because there was nothing else to do. The car slowed. A white wood frame house set back from the road, birch trees along the shoulder, a gravel driveway, a light on in a second-floor window. He told the driver to stop at the gate. He got out alone. Vivienne heard the car. She was at the desk. She had heard tires on gravel at the gate 50 meters down the drive, and she had been still for exactly as long as it took her to decide that running was not an option, and that she had, in some part of herself, expected this moment to arrive before her 48 hours were up. She closed the ledger. She put it in the desk drawer and turned the small key lock that came with the drawer. A residential lock. Nothing serious, but it was the principle. She stood. She went to the window and looked down the drive and saw a man walking up it alone. No second person, no visible flanking. Mateo walked the way he had always walked, like the ground owed him something and hadn't finished paying. Even from the second-floor window, even after everything, she recognized the particular set of his shoulders, the way he held his arms slightly away from his body, a habit from years of carrying weight he no longer carried. She watched him reach the front door. She heard the knock. Not a pound. A knock. 3 times, measured. She went downstairs. She stood at the door for a moment, then she opened it. He looked older. She thought that before anything else, before composure or calculation, he looked older than he had looked 3 days ago. There were specific lines around his eyes she did not remember being that deep, and his jaw was carrying a tension that she recognized as the kind that had been there since at least yesterday morning and had not released. He looked at her the same way she was looking at him. She saw him do it. A fast inventory, starting at her face, checking the rest of her, looking for something. She didn't know if he found it. "You drove yourself," she said. "Yes." "Ronan gave you this address?" "Yes." She stepped back from the door. It was not an invitation, and they both understood it as one anyway, because that was the particular grammar of 7 years. He came inside. He stood in the front hallway and looked at the space, the modest furniture, the foundation's framed materials on the wall, the quiet of a house that had clearly been used intermittently and carefully and never as a home. 3 years, he said. "Yes." "You set this up 3 years ago." "I set the foundation up 3 years ago," she said. "This was one property in a set of 3. I rotate." He looked at her. Something moved in his face that didn't quite arrive at any expression she could name. "You were preparing to leave 3 years ago." "I was preparing to have options," she said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes." She moved past him into the small front room, a table, 4 chairs, a window with plain curtains, and sat in one of the chairs because she needed to be sitting for this, and she was not going to stand in front of him in a posture that looked like she was braced for something. "Sit down, Mateo." He did. He pulled the chair out and sat down across from her with the table between them and put his hands flat on the surface, both of them, palms down, which was a thing she had learned to read as him requiring himself to stay physical, to not retreat into the gestural abstraction that powerful men used when they didn't want to be read. "The ledger," he said. "I have it." "Have you used it?" "No." He looked at her steadily. "The warehouse in the Bronx." She shook her head. "That wasn't me." A pause. He watched her the way he watched people when he was deciding whether they were lying. She sat with it because she was not lying, and she had learned not to fill his silences with defensive language. "Then who?" he said. "That's what I've been trying to understand." She put her hand on the table, not reaching toward him, just a placement, a signal that she was about to say something she'd considered carefully. "Mateo, I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear it before you react." "Ask." "When did Ronan first tell you about Lena Marek?" The question landed in the room and sat there. She watched Mateo's face, watched the micro-movement in the muscles around his eyes, the slight tightening that was not anger, something more internal than anger, something turning over. "He didn't tell me about her," Mateo said. "You met her through him." A beat. "At an event. A year ago, roughly. She was there as a guest of one of the associate families." "Whose guest specifically?" He was quiet for a moment. "She came in through Ronan's table." Vivienne nodded slowly. She let that sit. She watched him arrive at the edge of what she had already arrived at, watched his eyes move through it the way eyes move through a calculation you haven't finished but already don't like the shape of. "That doesn't mean—" he started. "I know it doesn't." She kept her voice even. "I'm not accusing him of anything I can prove yet, but Mateo—" She leaned forward just slightly. "The warehouse location, the timing of the Brooklyn movement, the account transfers I found in the ledger from 14 months ago. There's an entity in those transfers called Halcyon Meridian LLC that I have never encountered in any of your operational documentation. Have you? He was very still. Say that name again, he said. Halcyon Meridian LLC. He stared at the table surface. His jaw worked once, a small movement, restrained. Then he looked up at her, and the expression on his face was one she had only seen twice in 7 years. The particular look of a man who has understood something that changes the architecture of what he thought he knew. That account is Ronan's, he said. I set it up for him 8 years ago. It's his personal reserve outside the family structure. It was a loyalty arrangement, compensation for the transition years after my father. I haven't touched it since. I didn't think anyone else knew it existed. I didn't know it existed, she said. I found it in the ledger because someone was moving money through it in a pattern that didn't match any operational rationale I could construct. Small amounts. 14 months of small amounts, positioned in the reserves that feed your supplier network. He stood up. He stood up and walked to the window and stood with his back to her, and she watched his shoulders and waited because that was the only correct thing to do. He's been moving money through his personal account into my operational reserves, Matteo said, very quietly. Which means he's been funding something out of my own infrastructure. Or pre-positioning for a transition, she said. If the reserves were seeded through his account, the money trail would look like it originated internally. If someone was setting up a structure to claim continuity of operation after a leadership change, it would look like a natural succession. He turned around. His face was controlled in the way that faces are controlled when the thing underneath is significant. Not a takeover. A transfer. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. Between them was the table in 7 years, and a ledger, and a ring she had left on a nightstand in a penthouse 41 floors above the street, and none of it was resolved, and all of it was present. Vivienne. His voice had changed. Not softer, something more exposed than soft. The affair? Don't, she said. Not harshly, steadily. I need you to know. Not right now. She stood. Right now you need to go back to the city, and you need to look at Ronan Vale's account movements for the last 16 months, and you need to do it without telling him you're doing it. Can you access those records without his knowledge? I have a separate channel. Use it tonight. Don't use Carver. Don't use anyone in Ronan's lateral structure. Do it yourself. He nodded. He was still looking at her with that expression she couldn't fully name, something between recognition and something that had been building for longer than this morning and had finally, at cost, arrived at its own surface. You knew, he said, before last night. You knew something was wrong with the organization. I suspected. I didn't have the full shape of it. But you took the ledger. I took the ledger, she said, because it was mine. I built it, and because... She stopped. She made herself finish it because she had committed to honest, and she was not going to retreat into strategy in her own sentence. Because I needed to know whether what I was seeing in it was what I thought I was seeing, before I did anything with it. He stood in the front hallway of her foundation house, in the gray afternoon light of a Connecticut Monday, and looked at her like he was looking at the first accurate photograph of something he had been describing from memory for years. What are you going to do with it? He said. I don't know yet, she said. That depends on what you find tonight. He nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket. For a moment she thought he was going to produce the ring, the wedding ring, which she had assumed he'd taken from the nightstand, and she prepared something inside herself for that. But he took out a business card and put it on the table. Just a number, no name. This is a direct line, he said, in case you need to reach me and my personal cell is compromised. She looked at the card. She didn't pick it up. Go, Matteo, she said. He went. She heard his footsteps on the gravel, the car door, the engine, the sound of tires moving away down the road until it was replaced by the sound of the wind in the birch trees, which was quieter and less complicated. She stood in the front hallway alone. She went back upstairs. She sat at the desk and looked at the locked drawer. Her phone buzzed. The burner. A text from Helen Carrington. Ronan Vale. Halcyon Meridian LLC. Same registered agent. Same incorporation date. Sending secure file now. Vivienne sat very still. Same registered agent. Same incorporation date. Ronan had not merely moved money through his personal account into Matteo's operational reserves. Ronan had created Halcyon Meridian specifically. He had built a separate entity under the same corporate architecture as his personal reserve and had used it as a conduit, a pass-through that would, in a succession scenario, allow the financial structure to be reassigned to new leadership while appearing to trace back to the existing family operation. He had been building Mateo's replacement for at least a year and a half. The affair. Lena Marek at Ronan's table. The Miami weekend that Mateo hadn't mentioned in advance. The Brooklyn crew hitting a warehouse location only the Ledger knew. It wasn't a takeover. It was a managed dismantling. Ronan had been arranging for Mateo to become distracted, isolated, and compromised, using the affair as a wedge, using the marriage collapse as a destabilizing mechanism, using the resulting operational chaos to justify a transition to new leadership that Ronan himself would manage. And Vivienne's departure, the Ledger missing, the legal filing, the public signal of a fracturing at the top. That had not been an accident from Ronan's perspective. It had been useful. She had been useful. Her leaving had been, in Ronan's calculus, exactly the additional pressure point needed to push Mateo toward the edge of a crisis he couldn't manage alone. She had been a variable in someone else's plan. She sat with that for a long moment and felt the particular cold that comes from understanding you have been played. Not by the man you thought you were playing against, but by the one standing just outside your line of sight the whole time. She picked up the burner phone. She did not call Helen. She called the direct line on the card Mateo had left on the table downstairs. He answered on the first ring. "Don't go back to the compound," she said. A silence. "Why?" "Because Ronan already knows you came here. And if he knows what I just found out—" She stopped. She breathed once. "He's not going to wait for you to find it yourself." The silence on the line was different now, tighter. "Tell me what you found," Mateo said. She told him. She heard him breathing on the other end of the line, controlled, measured, the kind of breathing a man does when he is processing something that is reorganizing the floor beneath him, and he cannot afford to let it show in his body because his body was, right now, in a car on a Connecticut highway, surrounded by people he could no longer fully trust. When she finished, he didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, "Are you safe where you are? Not send me the documents. Not I need to see it. Not don't do anything until I get there." The first thing out of his mouth was whether she was safe. She noticed that. She filed it. "For now," she said. "How long?" "Unknown. If Ronan's people track this address through the same channel he used to track it for you, I have hours, not days. But Mateo—" She pressed her palm flat on the desk. "You need to move before he knows you've moved. If you go back to the compound, you're inside his information structure. He'll know every conversation you have." "I know." His voice was very quiet. "I need to get to the secondary records before he can sanitize them. There's a physical archive, not in the compound, a separate location, that Ronan doesn't have access to." "Where?" A pause. "I'm not going to tell you that on this line." "Fair." She accepted it. "Then go. Now. Before he makes the next move." "Vivienne, go," she said. For the second time today. But this time it meant something different than it had an hour ago, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. She ended the call. She sat in the second-floor room with the quiet window and the birch trees and the locked drawer and the weight of a situation that had shifted entirely in the last 4 hours. And she understood, with the particular clarity that arrives only when you've stopped arguing with what's in front of you, that she was no longer simply a woman who had left a marriage. She was now the only person outside Mateo's collapsing inner circle who had the full picture. And the man who had engineered that collapse did not yet know she had it. She opened the desk drawer. She took out the ledger. She turned to page 43 and started writing. She was on page 43 when the lights went out. Not a power failure, the desk lamp beside her stayed on, still drawing from the house circuit. The lights outside. The motion sensor fixtures mounted above the garage and along the front porch. The ones she had tested her first night here and confirmed had a 45-second delay before triggering. Those went dark all at once, simultaneously, which meant someone had cut the exterior sensor line at the junction box, which was mounted on the north side of the foundation wall, which was not visible from the road. Someone who knew where to cut. Vivienne was on her feet before the thought finished forming. She closed the ledger. She did not lock the drawer. No time. She crossed to the window in 4 steps and looked down at the driveway and saw nothing, which was worse than seeing something because it meant they were already past the perimeter she could observe. She moved to the hallway. She had a mental map of this house, the way she had a mental map of every space she spent time in. Exits, blind spots, the particular squeak of the third stair from the bottom that she had noted on her first walkthrough 3 years ago, and never repaired because an audio cue in your own building is an asset, not a flaw. She went to the closet at the end of the hall. Top shelf, back left corner, behind a folded blanket. A small canvas bag she had placed there on her first overnight stay. She pulled it down. Inside, a second burner phone still in its packaging, $3,000 in mixed bills, a set of car keys on a plain ring, and a folded piece of paper with 2 addresses written in her own hand. Not coded, because speed matters more than security when you're already past the point of security. She pocketed the money and the keys. She left the unpackaged burner. No time to set it up. She tucked the folded paper into her jacket. She went back to the desk room. She picked up the ledger. She stood in the center of the room for exactly 2 seconds and made the calculation she had been avoiding making since she arrived here, which was the calculation about what the ledger was worth compared to what it would cost her to carry it. She put it inside her jacket, against her ribs, and held it there with her left arm pressed flat against her side. Then she heard the back door. Not a forced entry, a key. The specific sound of a key in a lock, which was worse than forced entry by a distance she didn't have words for, because a key meant someone who had access to the Foundation's property management records, which were held by a property management company in Greenwich that she had vetted personally and that had 3 employees and that she had trusted. She moved to the bedroom at the front of the house. The window there opened onto the porch roof. A 4-foot drop to the porch railing, another 8 feet to the ground. She had measured it in her head the first time she stayed here. She was measuring it again now. She heard footsteps on the ground floor. More than one person. Moving with the particular quiet of people who had been told to be quiet rather than people who were naturally quiet, which meant trained but not exceptional, which meant she had a window. She opened the bedroom window. The latch was stiff. She hadn't opened this one before, a mistake she was acknowledging and filing away simultaneously. She put force into it, controlled, and it came free. She pushed the window up, swung her legs over the sill, dropped onto the porch roof in a crouch that sent a jolt up both knees that she ignored. She moved along the porch roof to the side of the house, away from the driveway. She could see the detached garage from here, a single-bay structure, separate from the house, connected by a gravel path. The car she had driven from the city was in it. The second set of keys in her pocket was for a different vehicle, a 10-year-old Subaru registered to the Foundation that she kept in the detached garage's second bay, which was not visible from the main driveway because the garage door faced the side yard. She dropped from the porch roof. Her left ankle turned on the uneven ground. Not a sprain, just a warning. And she absorbed it and kept moving along the side of the house in the tree shadow, away from the light from the back door which someone had left open. She heard a voice inside the house, male, saying her name. Not loudly. The tone of someone doing a room-by-room check, announcing themselves the way people do when they're not sure if their target is armed and they'd prefer to establish a non-confrontational posture before finding out. She reached the garage. The side door, not the main bay door, the personnel door on the north face, was unlocked because she had left it unlocked. She went in. She felt her way to the second bay in the dark, found the passenger door of the Subaru by touch, opened it, got in, and started the engine. She didn't turn the headlights on. She backed out of the garage slowly, navigating by the ambient light from the open back door of the house, across the side yard, through the gap in the split-rail fence at the property edge. She had opened that gap herself 6 months ago and told the Foundation's caretaker it was for drainage equipment access, and onto the service road that ran parallel to the main drive. She turned the lights on when she hit the public road. She drove north. Behind her, through the rear window, she could see a light moving in the upper floor of the house. Someone in the desk room. She pressed the accelerator and put the house behind a curve in the road and did not look back again. She drove for 20 minutes before she allowed herself to breathe fully. Then she pulled into the parking area of a closed garden center and sat in the car with the engine running and her hands on the wheel and took 3 slow, deliberate breaths. The ledger was still pressed against her ribs. She took it out and put it on the passenger seat. She needed to reach Mateo. Her burner, the one she'd used all day, was on the desk upstairs, which she had left in her exit, which meant it was now in the hands of whoever had used a key to enter a foundation property she had spent 3 years keeping clean. The property management company in Greenwich. 3 employees. One of them had access to the key registry for keeping clean. The property management company in Greenwich. 3 employees. One of them had access to the key registry for every property in the foundation's portfolio, and one of them had given that key to someone, and that someone had gotten there in under 4 hours from the moment Ronan Vale had given Matteo her address. Not Matteo's people. Matteo had come alone and left alone, and she had watched him drive away. Ronan's people. Which meant Ronan had run his own parallel track, used the same address Matteo had used, sourced through his own channels, and dispatched a team while Matteo was sitting across from her at the table. While they had been talking about Halcyon Meridian and the supplier network, and Ronan's 16 months of patient architecture, Ronan had already been moving people toward her location. He hadn't been waiting to see what Matteo would do. He had stopped waiting, which meant the text she'd intercepted from Helen, Accelerate, had already been acted on before Matteo's car reached her driveway. She sat in the garden center parking lot and felt the shape of what that meant. Ronan knew she had the ledger. Ronan knew she had found the account transfers. And now Ronan knew she had told Matteo, because the only explanation for accelerating this fast was that someone in Matteo's immediate orbit had been watching Matteo's movements and had reported the Connecticut trip in real time. Someone in the car, or on the phone, or in the building. She put the car in drive. She needed a phone. She needed to reach Matteo on the direct line number, which she had memorized. She memorized numbers the way other people memorized faces. It was a habit that had taken years to build, and that she had never regretted. And she needed to do it from a line that was not connected to anything. She found a gas station 4 miles up the road. Payphone on the exterior wall. She hadn't seen one in years, and she felt something close to gratitude for its continued existence. She pulled in. She got out. She fed coins from the emergency cash into the slot and dialed. Matteo answered on the second ring. Background noise. A car. Moving. "It's me," she said. They came to the house. A silence. Then, "Are you clear?" "Yes, I have the ledger, but Matteo..." She turned her back to the road, dropped her voice. "Someone reported your movements to Ronan in real time. The team reached my location inside 4 hours. That's too fast for a cold search. They had the address before you left the city." Another silence. She heard him say something, not into the phone, to someone else, and then the background noise changed, a door, and then quiet. "Say that again," he said. "Someone knew you were going to Connecticut before you got in the car. Either your car was monitored, or your phone was, or someone in the compound. Matteo, someone in your immediate circle is running a live feed to Ronan." She heard him breathe. She heard the specific quality of that breath. Not shock, because Matteo did not do shock in any audible way, but the sound of a man pressing hard against something he doesn't want to be true and finding that the pressure doesn't change its shape. "Carver," he said, quietly, almost to himself. She waited. "I had Carver run the address search this morning," Matteo said. "I told Ronan not to use him, but I used him myself to verify the property registration before I drove out." She closed her eyes for half a second. "Carver reports to Ronan." "Carver has reported to me for 6 years." "Yes," she said. "And to Ronan for how long?" The silence was longer this time. "Where are you?" he said. "Moving. I'll find a position and stay in it for 2 hours. After that, I need to relocate again." "I'm 40 minutes from the archive location. Once I have the physical records, I'll have everything I need to build a case against Ronan internally. But Vivienne," his voice shifted, dropped into something lower and more direct. "If he's already moved his people into the field, the archive may be compromised too. I need to know if he had access to the location." "Does anyone else know where it is?" "Officially no, but if Carver's been running information..." He stopped. She heard him work through it. "Carver drove me twice in the last month. Once to the archives building. I didn't go inside. I met someone in the lobby, but the address..." "He has the address," she said. "Yes." "Then don't go there." "I need those records." "Matteo." She kept her voice flat because flat was the only register that moved him when he was in operational mode. "If Ronan has Carver and Carver has the archive location, the archive is a controlled space right now. Going there puts you in a position of Ronan's choosing. That is the worst possible geometry." He was quiet. "You know I'm right," she said. "I know you're right," he said. It came out without his usual friction on admissions, which told her how much had shifted in the last 3 hours. "Then what do I have?" She looked at the ledger in her hand. "You have me," she said, "and I have 47 pages." What? She drove another 30 miles before she found a motel that took cash and didn't require ID from the woman who said her card was in her other bag and was only staying one night. The woman at the desk was 60-something, watching a small television, and looked at Vivienne with the specific incuriosity of someone who had long ago stopped finding anything surprising. Room 7. Ground floor. Parking directly outside the door. She went in. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened the ledger on her knees and spent 40 minutes going through every entry that touched Ronan Vale's name, his account designations, his operational jurisdiction. She cross-referenced against the grid she had built on the graph paper, which was still in her jacket pocket, slightly creased, and mapped the full transfer sequence again from memory, filling in the gaps she had left in her first pass. When she was done, she had a picture that was both more complete and more damaging than she had anticipated. Ronan had not merely been positioning for a succession. He had been actively facilitating incursions into Matteo's operational territory, small ones, targeted, deniable, the kind that could be attributed to ordinary market pressure from rival organizations rather than coordinated inside action. The Brooklyn Cruise warehouse hit was one. There had been 2 others in the preceding 8 months, both of which Vivienne had entries for in the ledger, but had not previously connected to any internal source. A supplier who had abruptly renegotiated terms. A city contact who had gone briefly dark. Small erosions that Matteo had absorbed and moved past, because individually they looked like friction, not architecture. They were architecture. Ronan had been sandpapering the empire for 16 months, reducing its surface adhesion, creating the conditions under which a transfer of control would look like a natural response to organizational stress rather than a manufactured one. And Lena Marek. Vivienne sat with that for a moment longer than the others. She had not let herself go fully into it yet, had kept it at the operational distance of the affair was introduced by Ronan's table and Matteo's distraction served Ronan's timeline, because the other dimension of it, the dimension that was not operational, was the dimension she was least equipped to be objective about. But sitting in room 7 of a cash motel 30 miles from her foundation house, with the ledger open on her knees, she went into it. Ronan had introduced them. He had positioned Lena Marek at his table at a family event knowing Matteo's nature. Knowing that Matteo, under operational pressure, under the particular fatigue of a man who had been performing dominance for 30 years, would respond to proximity and attention. Ronan knew him. Had known him for 19 years. He knew the pressure points the way a structural engineer knows where a building's weight actually sits. He had used a woman as a mechanism. He had used Matteo's weakness, not cruelty, just weakness, just the ordinary human failure of a man who had stopped paying attention to what he had at home, as a lever. And the lever had worked precisely as intended, and the marriage had fractured, and Vivienne had left, and in leaving had done exactly what Ronan needed her to do. She had taken the ledger. She sat with that very still. She had taken the ledger because it was hers. She had taken it because she needed to understand what she had seen in it. She had taken it as an act of autonomy in a moment when she had nothing else. And in doing so, she had removed the family's most sensitive intelligence document from the only place where Ronan could not access it, from Matteo's direct control, and put it in the hands of a woman who was now isolated, legally entangled, and running from a property team in Connecticut. If she had not taken it, Ronan could never have claimed it without exposing himself. Because she had taken it, Ronan could frame its disappearance as a hostile action by Matteo's estranged wife, could use it to argue that the organization's intelligence had been compromised, that Matteo's personal instability had created an operational crisis, that a transition of leadership was the only responsible response. She had been, without knowing it, the final piece of Ronan's design. She set the ledger down on the bed. She stared at the water-stained ceiling of room 7 and felt the particular nausea of understanding that you have been managed. Not by an enemy, by someone who knew you well enough to predict what you would do under pressure and had designed the pressure accordingly. She thought about the night she had stood in the doorway watching Matteo's hand on Lena Marek's back. She thought about 4 minutes and 30 seconds sitting on the edge of the bed. She thought about the wardrobe drawer and the false panel and the suitcase and the ring and the lobby and the street. Every choice she had made that night had been the correct choice from inside her own logic, and every choice had fed Ronan's plan. She sat up. She was not going to sit with this. Sitting with it had a shape, and the shape led somewhere she could not afford to go right now. She picked up the ledger. She turned to page 43, the page she had been writing on when the lights went out, and she continued the entry she had started, in her own code, adding the Halcyon Meridian connection, the Carver confirmation, the property management breach, the timeline of incursions. She wrote for 20 minutes, small, precise handwriting, filling the margins of 2 pages. Then she stopped. She looked at what she had written. The complete picture, across all 47 pages, plus the 2 she had just added, was enough. Not enough for a criminal proceeding, not in any court she could access without exposing everything, but enough for something that mattered more immediately. It was enough for the men inside Mateo's organization who were not Ronan. The senior associates, the family council members, the men who had given loyalty to the Viscari name specifically, and who would need to understand that the man offering them continuity had been the one engineering the crisis. She needed to get this in front of those men before Ronan did. She needed Mateo to convene them, and she needed to do it before Ronan moved to the next stage, whatever the next stage was, because Ronan had already accelerated, which meant his timeline had compressed, which meant he was not planning to wait for the architecture to mature naturally anymore. Something had shifted his schedule. She didn't know what. She needed to know. She picked up the motel's landline, analog, connected to nothing digital, and dialed Mateo's direct number. He answered immediately. "Where are you?" "Safe. Stationary. Listen to me." She kept her voice low and even. "I need to know something. In the last 72 hours, before last night, was there any communication between Ronan and your father?" A pause. "My father is in a medical facility in Connecticut. He doesn't communicate with anyone operationally." "I know, but Ronan visits him." "Ronan visits him every 2 weeks. It's been a standing arrangement for years." "When was the last visit?" She heard Mateo go still, the particular quality of stillness that travels through a phone line when someone stops moving. 4 days ago, he said. 4 days ago, 2 days before the party. 1 day before she had found the first anomalous entry in the ledger that had sent her back through every page. 3 days before Ronan had accelerated. "Mateo," she said, "your father built the original network, the one that predated the current structure by 15 years. Does Ronan know the details of that network?" "My father told him things over the years, yes. They were close." "Is there anything in that original network, assets, accounts, connections, that would still have operational value today?" A long silence. "There's a set of accounts," Mateo said slowly. "My father's original capital structure. I've never touched them because touching them requires documentation I don't have access to it. My father's personal authorization codes. They've been dormant for 15 years. They're not in any current record." "Are they in the ledger?" "No. I kept them off the ledger deliberately. Those accounts predate the ledger system." She closed her eyes. Mateo, she said, "if Ronan has been visiting your father every 2 weeks, and your father is in a facility with limited oversight, and Ronan has been building a succession structure for 16 months, he's been getting the codes," Mateo said. His voice had gone very flat. The flatness of a man hitting a floor he didn't know was there. "My father doesn't know what he's giving him. He has good days and bad days. On a bad day, if Ronan asked him the right way, he would give him whatever he asked for," she said. Silence. "Those accounts," Mateo said. "If Ronan has the authorization codes, he can access a capital reserve of—" He stopped. "It would fund a full operational transition. New structure, new territory, new personnel. He wouldn't need the family's existing assets at all. He'd have enough to build parallel." "He's not taking over your empire," she said. "He's building a replacement." She heard Mateo's breathing change. She heard, beneath the controlled register he maintained, the thing he would not say aloud. The knowledge that the man he had trusted above every other person in his adult life had spent the last year and a half dismantling him the way you dismantle a house before you build something new on the same lot. "Are you somewhere you can stay for another 2 hours?" he said. "Yes. I need to get to my father before Ronan realizes I know about the codes. If my father still has any record of what he gave him—" He stopped. "I need proof." something Ronan can't counter. Go, she said. But Matteo, take no one, drive yourself, don't use a company vehicle. Ronan has eyes on your regular cars. I know. A pause. I'll call you from the facility. He hung up. She set the phone down. She looked at the ledger on the bed. 47 pages. 49 now. A complete architecture of an organization's interior life, built by a woman who had spent 7 years as its most careful observer. And still, even with all of it, she had missed the thing that mattered most, that the real target was never the empire. The real target was the foundation beneath it. Ennio Vescari's original network. The dormant accounts. The authorization codes that only a man with dementia-fogged clarity could provide, on a good day, to someone he trusted, in a medical facility where no one was watching closely enough. Ronan had been preparing this since before Matteo had made any of his mistakes. The affair, the marriage fracture, the operational erosions, those were acceleration mechanisms, not the plan itself. The plan was older and deeper, and had been in motion since long before Vivienne had ever stood in a doorway watching a man's hand on a woman's back. She had been right that she was a variable in someone else's plan. She had been wrong about how long the plan had been running. She stood up. She went to the window and looked out at the parking lot. Her car, 2 others, a light above the ice machine, the road beyond the lot quiet and dark. She put her palm flat against the cold glass. She was not the person she had been 48 hours ago. She could feel that with some precision, not that she had changed her values or her read of the situation, but that the cost of what she was carrying had reached a weight that changed how she stood under it. She had walked out of that penthouse with 1 suitcase and a locked case, and the composure of a woman who had made a clean decision. Nothing about this was clean anymore. The ledger was evidence of something bigger than a divorce, bigger than a betrayal between a husband and a wife, bigger than Ronan Vale's ambitions or Matteo Vescari's failures, or a woman in a green dress at a party that Vivienne had watched from the wrong doorway. She moved away from the window. She sat on the edge of the bed. She opened the ledger to a blank page near the back and wrote 2 lines, in plain English, no code. If this ledger reaches anyone other than Matteo Vescari or his designate, the secondary documentation held in Providence activates automatically. The account referenced as HM7 in the Providence file is registered in the name of the sitting United States District Attorney for the Southern District of New York. She looked at what she had written. It was a bluff, partially. The Providence safety deposit box existed and contained the cipher key and a secondary document package. The HM7 account, Halcyon Meridian's primary channel, was real and documented. The U.S. Attorney connection was something she had noted as a possibility months ago when she had begun building her exit architecture, and that she had researched but not yet confirmed. But Ronan didn't know that, and if the ledger reached Ronan's hands, which was a possibility she had to plan for, she needed him to read that page before he read anything else, and understand that moving against her was not a contained action. She closed the ledger. She lay down on the bed without removing her jacket, the ledger beside her, one hand resting on it, and stared at the ceiling and waited for Matteo to call. The call came 43 minutes later. She grabbed the phone on the first ring. Matteo's voice was different. She had heard it under pressure many times and had cataloged its registers the way you catalog a landscape you cross regularly. She had heard his controlled anger, his managed grief when his father's diagnosis had first come through, his cold precision in the middle of a crisis. She had not heard this particular register before. It was the voice of a man who has been hit by something and has not yet fully landed. "He's gone," Matteo said. She sat up. "What do you mean, gone?" "My father. He's not at the facility. He was discharged 3 hours ago. Voluntary discharge authorized by a medical power of attorney." A pause, and she heard in that pause the effort it took him to keep his voice from breaking register. "The POA on file is Ronan Vale." She sat on the edge of the bed in room 7 of a cash motel and felt the floor of the situation drop away beneath her in a way that was almost physical. Ronan had Ennio Vescari. Not as leverage, not as a threat. Ronan had removed him from the facility, from oversight, from any location Matteo could access, which meant Ennio's account of what he had or had not given Ronan in those bi-weekly visits was now Ronan's to manage. The last witness to what Ronan had taken was in Ronan's hands. "Matteo," she said. "I know." Flat. Absolutely flat. Listen to me. Where are you right now? The facility parking lot. Do not go back to the city. Do not contact anyone from your regular structure. Do you have a location that Ronan has never had access to? Not through Carver, not through any associate. A location that exists entirely outside the family's information architecture. A long pause. Yes, he said. Go there. Right now. And Mateo? She pressed the phone harder against her ear. Bring nothing that has been in the compound in the last 72 hours. No phone, no device, nothing Carver has touched. Vivienne, his voice dropped. He has my father. I know. My father doesn't know where he is or what's happening. He has good days and bad days, and today could be either, and Ronan knows how to work a bad day. I know, she said again. That is why we have to move tonight, not tomorrow, tonight. A silence that had a different texture than the others. Not calculation, not control, but the sound of a man standing in a parking lot in the dark, understanding that the person he is talking to is, at this particular moment, the only person he can trust with something that has no tactical answer. Where do I meet you? He said. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the 2 lines she had written in plain English near the back. She thought about the Providence safety deposit box and the cipher key inside it, and the secondary document package that was, in fact, not as comprehensive as she had implied in those 2 lines, but that could become comprehensive if she had 12 hours and a clear line to Helen Carrington's legal team. I'll send you coordinates, she said, through the payphone here to the direct line. Give me 20 minutes. I'll be moving. Good. She hung up. She sat for a moment, then she stood, put the ledger inside her jacket, picked up her keys, and walked out of room 7 into the cold, dark parking lot. The motel sign hummed behind her. The road ahead was empty. She got in the Subaru, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot heading east toward a location she had not told anyone about. Not Helen, not Mateo, not anyone, because it was the one place she had prepared specifically for the scenario in which every other layer had been stripped away. She had built the exit architecture 3 years ago. She had built this part of it for the version of herself who had run out of options. She drove into the dark with the ledger pressed against her ribs, and the cold particular knowledge that the woman who had left a penthouse with a suitcase and a locked case 2 nights ago no longer fully existed. The woman driving east through a Connecticut night with someone else's father as a hostage and a ledger that could end an empire pressed against her chest. That woman was someone she was only just beginning to meet. She drove east for 31 minutes before she turned onto the access road. It was unpaved, gravel over packed dirt, the kind of road that appears on county maps as a property easement and that most people drive past without registering. She had found it 2 years ago on a survey map of the region, had driven it twice to memorize its condition, and had never brought anyone here or mentioned it in any document connected to her name. The property at the end of the road was registered to a land trust, not the Cross Farrell Foundation, a different entity entirely, one she had established through a separate attorney in a separate state using a capital contribution from an account that predated her marriage. It was a 12-acre parcel with a small structure on it. Not a house exactly, more a hunting cabin that had been renovated once in the 1980s and not significantly touched since. 2 rooms, a wood stove, running water from a well. No internet, no cable line, a single landline phone that she had confirmed still carried a dial tone on her last visit 8 months ago. She pulled up to the cabin and cut the engine. She sat for a moment. The darkness here was complete. No ambient glow from any town, no traffic noise, just the sound of the car ticking as the engine cooled and the wind doing something low in the trees at the property's edge. She got out. She went inside. The cabin smelled of cold wood and disuse. She found the kerosene lamp on the shelf beside the door where she had left it, lit it, and set it on the table in the center of the main room. She went to the landline, dial tone. She exhaled once, a small sound she made to no one. She called Mateo's direct line from the landline and gave him the county road number and the access road marker, a rusted gate post with a reflective strip she had put there herself, and told him to approach without headlights for the last half-mile and to leave his car at the gate and walk in. He said he was 40 minutes out. She said she would be here. She used the 40 minutes. She spread the ledger open on the table and went through it one final time. Not reading, she knew it by now, but organizing. She separated the entries into 3 categories in her head. What documented Ronan's financial architecture, what documented the operational incursions, and what documented the timeline of Ennio Viscari's involvement. The third category was the thinnest. She had entries that placed Ronan at the family compound during periods that corresponded to his bi-weekly visits to the facility, entries that showed account activity in the days following those visits, but nothing that constituted direct evidence of what had been said or given. Circumstantial. Strong, circumstantially. Not proof. The proof was Ennio, and Ennio was with Ronan. She heard footsteps on the gravel outside 22 minutes before she expected them, and she was on her feet with her hand on the lamp before the footsteps resolved into a single set, irregular on the uneven ground, someone moving without lights and navigating by shape. A knock. 3 times. The same cadence as the penthouse door. She opened it. Matteo came in and she saw immediately that he had been in a car too long and had not slept and had absorbed several hours of the kind of information that doesn't process cleanly. He was wearing the same jacket he had worn to her foundation house. There was a small cut above his left eyebrow she hadn't noticed before, recent, already dried, from something she didn't ask about yet. He looked at the lamp, at the ledger on the table, at her. "You made good time," she said. "I drove fast." He came to the table. He stood on the other side of it from her and looked at the ledger. "What have you decided?" She looked at him. "Sit down first." "I'm fine standing." "Matteo." She kept her voice even. "Sit down." He sat. He put his elbows on the table and pressed his fingers against his forehead for a moment. A gesture she had seen maybe twice in 7 years, the specific gesture of a man allowing himself, briefly, to be tired. Then he dropped his hands. "He called me," Matteo said. "Ronan, while I was driving here." She went still. "What did he say?" "He said my father was safe and comfortable, and that he was being cared for by people who knew his medical needs. He said this as though it was a courtesy call." Matteo's jaw tightened. "He said he thought it was time we had a conversation, man to man, at the compound." "He's calling you back to the compound?" "Yes. He's had 8 hours to position people, and you've been off the grid. If you walk into the compound now, I know what happens if I walk into the compound now." He looked at her directly. "I told him I needed 24 hours to consider his request. He said that was reasonable. He said he hoped I understood that the situation had moved beyond personal matters." A pause. "He said he hoped you were somewhere comfortable." The last sentence landed in the room with a weight that was not subtle. "He knows I'm not at the foundation house," she thought. "He sent people there and I was gone, and now he knows I'm loose and he's telling Matteo he knows. He's telling Matteo without saying it directly that I am a variable he is aware of. He's reminding you I exist," she said. "Yes." "To see if you'll volunteer my location." "Yes." Matteo looked at her steadily. "I didn't." She held his look. She believed him. She wasn't sure that believing him was rational, but she did it anyway because the alternative was a level of sustained suspicion. She could not afford right now, and because she had been reading this man for 7 years, and his face, in this lamplight, in this cabin in the middle of the night, was telling her the truth. "He has leverage," she said. "Your father. And he knows I have the ledger because he sent people to get it, and I was gone. That's 2 things he doesn't control. He's trying to compress the timeline before either one becomes a problem for him." 24 hours. "He won't wait 24 hours. That was a number he offered because you needed one. He's already moving." She leaned forward. "Matteo, the family council, who can you reach that has no lateral connection to Ronan?" He thought. She watched him think, not performing it, actually working through the map of his organization in real time. "Ferrante," he said. "Anton Ferrante. He runs the Northern Territory. He and Ronan have never been close. There's a history there, a boundary dispute from 8 years ago that Ronan handled badly. Ferrante remembers. Would Ferrante listen to you off-grid? If I gave him a reason." "The ledger is your reason." She put her hand flat on it. "I can translate the relevant sections, the financial architecture, the operational incursions, written out in plain language, documented, with account numbers. That's your reason. It'll take time. I have 3 hours before the window closes." She pulled the ledger toward her and picked up the pen from beside it. "You reach Ferrante. Tell him you need an emergency council call. Not at the compound, somewhere Ronan doesn't know. You have a location?" "I have 2. Use the one Ferrante suggests, not the one you offer. Let him choose the ground. It makes him a participant instead of an audience. Matteo looked at her for a moment. You've thought about all of this. I've had a long night. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, something drier and more rueful than a smile. He took out a phone, not his personal cell, a different one, plain, prepaid by the look of it, and made the call. She started translating the ledger. Anton Ferrante was 64 years old and had been in the Viscari family's northern operations since he was 32 and had the specific characteristics of a man who had survived long enough in a dangerous business to have developed an extremely sensitive early warning system for when the ground beneath him was shifting. He picked up on the second ring and listened to Matteo for 90 seconds without speaking. Then he said he would make 2 calls of his own and suggested a location, a private room above a restaurant in Yonkers that his wife's family owned and that had no connection to any family business. Matteo said yes. 4 hours. That was the window Ferrante needed to make his calls and get to Yonkers. It was currently 11:47 at night. Vivienne wrote for 3 hours without stopping except to refill the kerosene lamp once when it guttered. She translated 41 of the ledger's 49 pages into plain English, organized by category, with the account numbers written out longhand and the dates of each relevant transfer listed chronologically. She was not a lawyer, and this was not a legal brief. It was a narrative, the way she had always understood information best, the way she had built the ledger in the first place, as a story with actors and sequences and consequences, written for someone who needed to understand what had happened rather than what could be proven in a courtroom. Matteo sat at the other end of the table and did not speak while she wrote. He drank water from the cabin's tap. He looked at his hands sometimes. Once she glanced up and found him watching her with an expression she did not examine at length because she had too much left to write. At 2:40 in the morning, she set the pen down. Her hand ached. The small muscles across her palm and the base of her thumb had been working for 3 hours at the concentrated pace of someone producing something under a deadline, and the ache was specific and real, and she noticed it with the part of her mind that was not focused on the stack of papers in front of her. Done, she said. He reached across the table. She let him take the papers. She watched him read the first 3 pages with the focused speed of a man who reads operational documents for a living, his eyes moving fast across the lines, pausing at the account numbers. He read for 15 minutes. She waited. When he finished the last page, he set the stack down carefully. The deliberateness of someone managing how much force they allow themselves to use on objects when the alternative is worse. He's been running this since before my father's stroke, Matteo said. I think so. The earliest account activity I can trace is just over 2 years before the stroke. He may have anticipated the stroke, or he may have started earlier and accelerated when it happened. My father trusted him more than he trusted anyone. A pause. More than he trusted me in some ways. I was always the future. Ronan was the present. She didn't say anything. She let him have the sentence. The affair, he said. He was looking at the papers, not at her. You have it in here, the timeline. Yes. He introduced her. He set it up. That's what the evidence suggests. He looked up. Vivienne, I need to say, not now. She said it the same way she had said it at the foundation house. Steady, not cutting him off. Placing it. There's time for that later. Right now I need you focused. He held her look for a moment. Then he nodded. He picked up the prepaid phone. I need to tell Ferrante we're coming. Both of us? You have the ledger? You built the case? Yes. Both of us. She considered it. Walking into a room with 2 senior men from a criminal organization, presenting evidence against the man who had been running their operations, relying on a dynamic she had observed but never directly participated in, she ran the calculation and arrived at the conclusion that the risk of going was smaller than the risk of letting Matteo go without the full documentation in the hands of the person who could answer questions about it. All right, she said. Both of us. The drive to Yonkers took 50 minutes. Matteo drove. Vivienne sat in the passenger seat with the translated pages in her jacket and the ledger in the bag at her feet. Neither of them spoke for long stretches, and the silences were not comfortable, but they were not hostile. They were the silences of 2 people carrying a significant weight in the same direction, which is a different kind of silence from most. Halfway there, his phone, the prepaid one, Rang. He looked at the screen, showed it to her. A number she didn't recognize. He answered. Put it on speaker. Vescari. The voice was male, unknown to her, flat and professional. This is a courtesy. You should know that Ronan Vale has called an emergency council meeting for 6 a.m. at the compound. He's telling the senior members that your wife has stolen operational intelligence and that you've left the city under circumstances that suggest instability. He is proposing an interim governance structure pending a full council review of your leadership. Mateo's hands on the wheel didn't move. Who is this? He said. Someone who has been watching Ronan Vale for 11 months for reasons unrelated to your family's internal politics. We have mutual interest in his exposure. That's all I'll say on an open line. What do you want? Nothing tonight. I want you to get to Ferrante before 6 a.m. That's all. A pause. Your wife was right about the Providence documentation. The HM7 account connects to a name that neither you nor I want involved in this quietly. The line went dead. Vivienne stared at the dashboard. The HM7 account. The 2 lines she had written in the back of the ledger. The partial bluff about the U.S. attorney connection. She had written it in plain English in a ledger that she had carried on her person since leaving the motel. No one had seen those lines except her, except she had left the ledger on the desk at the foundation house for approximately 6 minutes while she went to the window to look at the driveway when Mateo arrived. 6 minutes. While Ronan's people were already in the house, coming through the back door. One of them had photographed the pages, which meant Ronan had seen the HM7 notation too, which meant the voice on the phone had information from Ronan's own intelligence pool. Someone inside Ronan's structure was running a countertrack. She filed it. She filed it under things she could not fully understand right now and that she needed to keep visible. Drive faster, she said. He drove faster. The restaurant in Yonkers had a side entrance on a street that was deserted at 3:40 in the morning. A man Vivienne didn't know met them at the door. Mid-50s, wide through the shoulders, said nothing, led them up a back staircase to a room that had 4 chairs, a table, a single overhead light, and Anton Ferrante. Ferrante was compact and gray-haired and had the quality of a man who has spent decades learning how to take up exactly as much space as he needs, and no more. He stood when they came in. He looked at Mateo first, the look of a man taking a reading, and then he looked at Vivienne for a long moment. Mrs. Vescari, he said. Mr. Ferrante. She sat before he offered it, because waiting to be offered a chair in this room was a posture she could not afford. He sat. Mateo sat. The silent man remained standing near the door. I've made my calls, Ferrante said. Polly Marn is an hour out. Cessa sent his apologies, but is listening on a secure line. He placed a phone on the table, face up. They've heard Ronan's version. They're here to hear yours. Mateo leaned forward. He talked for 12 minutes, uninterrupted, precise. He laid out the sequence from the warehouse raid to the Connecticut visit to Ennio's removal from the facility to the 6 a.m. council call. He did not editorialize. He did not perform injury. He stated facts and let the facts perform for themselves, which was, Vivienne thought, probably the most effective he had ever been in her presence. When he finished, she put the translated pages on the table. These are translated summaries from the original ledger, she said. The ledger is encoded, and I am the only person who can read it in full. The summaries cover the account transfers, the operational incursion timeline, and the financial architecture of the Halcyon Meridian structure. The account numbers are verifiable through independent banking records. The dates of the operational incursions correspond to incidents your organizations have already absorbed and attributed to external competition. Ferrante looked at the top page. He read it. Polly Marn arrived 20 minutes later. A big man, unhurried, who shook Mateo's hand and looked at Vivienne with the particular assessment of someone recalibrating a prior conclusion. He read the pages Ferrante handed him without sitting down. The phone on the table, Cessa's line, was silent but present. At 4:30 in the morning, Ferrante set the last page down. Ronan has called this council meeting for 6, he said. He's framing it as a stability measure. If we walk into that room without a counterposition, the narrative is already set. He looked at Mateo. You need to be in that room. I know. With this, Ferrante tapped the pages. And with her. Mateo looked at Vivienne. She kept her face still. She's a civilian, Marn said. Not hostile, observational. She built the document, Ferrante said. She's the only one who can authenticate it. If Ronan contests the ledger's integrity, she's the answer to that contest. He looked at Vivienne again. Are you willing? She thought about Ennio Vescari in an unknown location. She thought about a man who had spent 19 years building a betrayal from the inside of trust. She thought about 49 pages written in a code only she could read. Yes, she said. Ferrante nodded. He picked up his own phone and made a call, a brief one. When he hung up, he said, Ronan doesn't know Polly and I are in contact with you. He believes this meeting is set, and the council is coming to him. He will be at the compound by 5:30. My father, Matteo said. I have people looking for the location. Your father's physician, the attending from the facility. He's been contacted. He's cooperating. Ferrante met Matteo's eyes. We'll find him. Matteo nodded once. Something in the set of his face changed. Not relief, not yet, but the particular change of a man who has been carrying something alone and has just been told he doesn't have to. They left for the compound at 5:10, 3 cars, Vivienne in the second, with Matteo. He drove again. She sat with the ledger in her lap and the translated pages inside her jacket, and watched the pre-dawn city slide past the window. Streets empty, lights catching rain-wet pavement, the particular beauty of a city before it wakes up and becomes itself again. If Ronan has people positioned inside the compound, she started. Ferrante's man went in an hour ago, staff entrance. Matteo kept his eyes on the road. He'll know the positions before we arrive. And if Ronan moves before 6, then we adjust. She looked at him. You're calm. I'm not calm. He glanced at her briefly. I'm past the part where calm is the right word. I'm just moving. She understood that. She was doing the same thing. There was a phase on the far side of fear where the body just commits to the direction it's going and stops consulting the part of the brain that measures risk, and she had crossed into it somewhere around 3 in the morning in the cabin with the pen in her aching hand. They were 4 blocks from the compound when Matteo's prepaid phone rang again. He answered, listened. His jaw tightened. He handed the phone to her. It was Ferrante's man inside the compound. His voice was low and fast. Vale arrived at 4:58. He's not alone. There are 6 men I don't recognize on the interior, armed. He's not waiting for 6. Has he secured the council room? She kept her voice flat. He's in the operations room, with someone else. A pause. A woman. Dark hair. She came in with him. Vivienne felt something move through her chest. Not anger, something colder than anger. The specific cold of a thing clicking into its final shape. Lena Marek. At the compound. With Ronan. At 5 in the morning. Not a mistress. Never just a mistress. A partner. Possibly the cleaner. The person who would manage the transition's public-facing elements once Ronan had the organizational control. Someone who had been in the architecture from the beginning, longer than the affair, longer than the carefully positioned introduction at the family event. How many of the 6 men are covering the main access, she said. 2 at the front, 2 at the east corridor, 2 on the operations room door. She looked at Matteo. He had heard. She watched him calculate. There's a service corridor, he said, half to her, half to himself. Kitchen level. Connects to a utility access that comes up inside the compound's secondary structure. Ronan doesn't know it exists. My father had it built before Ronan came on board. She handed the phone back. Tell Ferrante's man to hold position and stay invisible. We're coming in through the service corridor. Matteo took the phone, relayed it, hung up. He pulled the car to the curb 2 blocks out. Got out. She got out. The air was cold and damp, the sky beginning to show the first gray suggestion of dawn at the eastern edge. They stood on the pavement for a moment. When we get into that room, Matteo said, let me go first. I'm not letting you go first so you can have a conversation with him alone before I'm in the room. He looked at her, a long look, the kind that in 7 years of marriage had usually preceded either an argument or something honest. I wasn't going to... He stopped. He pressed his mouth together. Fine. Together. Together. They moved. The service entrance was in an alley off the building's south face, a loading dock, locked, that Matteo opened with a physical key on his personal ring, the kind of key that doesn't appear in any electronic access log. They went in. The kitchen corridor was dim, institutional, the smell of industrial cleaning fluid and metal. They moved through it quickly, single file, Matteo in front. A staircase. Up 2 levels. A door. Push bar, no lock from this side. He eased it open. A utility corridor. Bare concrete pipework overhead, a single fluorescent tube casting flat white light. 30 feet ahead, another door. Behind that door, based on the compound's layout she had memorized years ago, the secondary access to the operations room. They were at the door when they heard voices. Ronan's voice coming through the door's gap. Low, controlled. The voice of a man who believes he is managing a situation he has fully contained. And another voice, sir, younger, female, the particular precision of someone running through a checklist. Lena Marek. Matteo's hand was on the push bar. His knuckles were white. She could see the cut above his eyebrow in the flat fluorescent light. Dry blood, a small precise wound, the kind you get when something sharp catches you at the wrong angle. She put her hand over his on the push bar. He looked at her. She kept her voice below a whisper, barely breath. The ledger first. Before anything else. Get me in front of everyone in that room before he can establish the narrative. His hand under hers was rigid. She felt him pull against the instinct that had gotten him to this point. The instinct that was 40 years of a particular kind of man who solves proximity problems with force. He breathed once. He nodded. She took the ledger from her bag and held it against her chest. He pressed the push bar down. The door opened into the operations room, and Ronan Vale turned from the table where he was standing and saw Matteo Vescari, and then, half a step behind him, Vivienne Cross with 49 pages of encoded intelligence pressed flat against her sternum, and the expression that moved across Ronan's face in the first quarter second, before the control came down over it like a shutter, was the expression of a man who has run every calculation and has just encountered the variable he failed to account for. The 6 men in the room moved, 2 toward the door, 2 toward Matteo. 2 stayed still, reading, recalibrating. Lena Marek stood at the far end of the table and looked at Vivienne with an expression that was not guilt and was not fear, but was the careful evaluation of someone encountering a problem they had been told was solved. Ronan Vale looked at the ledger. Then he looked at Vivienne. Mrs. Vescari, he said. The same cadence as Ferrante. The same 2 words, but with a different weight under them. Not assessment, not respect, but the particular register of a man who is deciding, in real time, whether the woman standing in front of him is a problem he can still manage, or one that has already moved past the stage where management is the right word. She looked back at him. She did not look away. Behind her, she heard the door at the far end of the corridor open. Ferrante's people, coming through the front. The timing she had not confirmed but had trusted Ferrante to execute. She heard it in the change in the room's atmosphere before she heard the actual sound. The slight shift in how the 6 men positioned. The micro-adjustment of people receiving new information through their peripheral vision. Ronan heard it too. She watched him understand in the space of 2 seconds that the room he had spent 16 months building toward this morning was not the room he was standing in. He looked at the ledger one more time. Then he looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has just run out of moves and knows it, and is deciding whether to admit that to himself or to keep moving forward anyway on pure momentum. And she met that look and held it, and did not give him anything in her face that he could use. And the distance between them across the operations room table was 8 feet, and the distance between everything that had been and everything that was about to happen was the next sentence out of his mouth. And the room held its breath. And Vivienne Cross stood her ground and waited for him to speak. Ronan Vale said nothing. That was the tell. In 37 years of operating inside rooms where silence was a weapon, Vivienne had learned that the men who talked when cornered were manageable, and the men who went quiet were the ones who were still calculating, still looking for the angle, still refusing to accept that the geometry had closed around them. Ronan went quiet. He stood at the head of the operations table and looked at the ledger in her hands and said absolutely nothing, and that silence was the most dangerous thing in the room. Then Ferrante walked through the door behind her. He came in with 2 of his own men and Polly Marne at his shoulder, and the 6 men Ronan had positioned around the room did the thing that trained men do when they suddenly find themselves outnumbered in a space they thought they controlled. A collective micro-stillness, a recalibration, hands that had been moving toward jackets going carefully still. Ronan watched Ferrante cross the room. He watched Polly Marn. He looked at the table, at the phone sitting face up on it, Sessa's open line, which had been running since Yonkers and which Ronan did not know had been running. And something moved in his face. Not panic, the thing underneath panic, the recognition that arrives before the emotion does. Anton, Ronan said, the first word out of him. And it was a name, not a sentence, not a position, just a name, testing the temperature. Ferrante looked at him the way you look at something you've been watching for a long time and have finally confirmed. Sit down, Ronan. This isn't... Sit down! Ronan sat. Lena Marek had not moved from her position at the far end of the table. She was watching Vivienne with the particular focus of someone who has been briefed on a variable and is now encountering it in 3 dimensions for the first time. Vivienne looked back at her, took a full second, unhurried, the kind of look that catalogs and then sets aside. And then she put the ledger on the table. The ledger is encoded, she said. She was speaking to the room, to Ferrante and Marn, and the silent phone, and the 6 men who were now Ronan's problem to manage rather than his assets. I built the encoding system, and I am the only person who can read it in full. What I have here, she pulled the translated pages from her jacket and laid them beside the ledger, is a plain language translation of the entries relevant to what you need to understand this morning. She looked at Ferrante. He nodded once. She began. She did not editorialize. She did not perform. She went through the translated pages in sequence, the account transfers, the Halcyon Meridian structure, the operational incursion timeline, the biweekly visits to the medical facility, the authorization codes, and she spoke in the flat, precise register of someone who has organized this information so many times it has become a second language. She was aware of Ronan across the table. She was aware of Matteo standing 4 feet to her left, very still, his arms at his sides. She was aware of Lena Marek's breathing, which had changed in the first 3 minutes of her account and had not normalized. She spoke for 22 minutes. When she finished, the room was quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. The earlier silence had been tactical. This one was the silence of people absorbing something that had rearranged the floor beneath them. Ferrante picked up the top translated page. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Ronan. The Halcyon Meridian account, Ferrante said. You want to tell me that's something else? Ronan's hands were flat on the table. He looked at them for a moment, then up at Ferrante. You're going to believe a document prepared by a woman who walked out of this family with stolen intelligence. I'm going to believe account numbers, Ferrante said, which I can verify by end of business today. He set the page down. And I'm going to believe Ennio Vescari when we find him and ask him what he was asked during those visits. Something shifted in Ronan's posture. Minimal, a fraction of an inch in the set of his shoulders. But Vivienne had spent 22 minutes watching him, and she caught it. Where is he, Ronan? Matteo's voice, the first time he had spoken since they entered the room, low and completely level. Where is my father? Ronan looked at him. The look between them was long and had 19 years running underneath it, like a current under ice, and Vivienne watched both men feel the weight of it, and neither of them flinch from it. He's safe, Ronan said. That's not what I asked. A pause. Ronan looked at the table again. Then he said an address, a property in Westchester, a house belonging to a name that Ferrante's man wrote down immediately. Ronan said it without further negotiation, without conditions, without the angle that Vivienne had been waiting for him to produce. He just said it, and in saying it, he was acknowledging something he had not yet said in words. Ferrante's man was on his phone within 30 seconds. Lena Marek moved for the first time. She shifted her weight, a small shift, away from the table, toward the room's side exit, and one of Ferrante's men was in front of that exit before she completed the movement. She stopped. She looked at the man. She looked at Vivienne. I want an attorney, she said. Her voice was steady. She was good at steady, Vivienne registered. She had been good at it at the party too, the steadiness of someone performing composure rather than possessing it, but performing it well enough that the difference required close observation. You'll have one, Ferrante said. Sit down. She sat. Ronan looked at Vivienne. It was a direct look, the first one he had given her since she walked into the room. And it was not hostile, and it was not appealing, and it was not the look of a man trying to manage her. It was the look of a man who had run out of management and was now simply present in the room with the consequences of himself. "You found it in the ledger," he said. "The Halcyon account." "Yes." "I didn't think you'd go back through the full sequence." "I know you didn't." He nodded slowly. "Once." The nod of a man confirming a calculation he had run too late. "When?" "The second night, after I found the foundation house had been accessed." She held his look. "You moved too fast once Mateo came to Connecticut. If you'd waited another 24 hours, I might not have had time to map the full transfer sequence before your people reached me." Something crossed his face. Not admiration, not quite, but the professional acknowledgement of a man who can recognize a well-played sequence even when it's the one that ended him. "You're better at this than I accounted for," he said. "Most people are," she said. He looked away. Mateo's phone, the prepaid one, buzzed. He looked at it. His face did not change expression, but something in his jaw released, just slightly, the way it releases when a thing you have been braced against stops pressing. "They have him," he said. "To the room, and to no one, specifically. My father's at the Westchester property. They say he's fine." Vivienne let out a breath, a small one. She pressed her lips together. Ferrante stood. He looked at Ronan with the expression of a man closing a chapter he had long anticipated. "You'll be held here until the council convenes a formal review. Full council. All members." He looked at the 6 men Ronan had brought. "These men can leave." They were following instructions. Their instructions have changed. The 6 men looked at each other. They looked at Ronan. Ronan said nothing. They left. The room was quieter with them gone, smaller. The overhead lights, which were the compound's industrial fluorescence, had the quality of light that makes everything look like what it actually is rather than what it presents itself as. And in that light, Ronan Vale looked 61 years old and tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Vivienne picked up the ledger. She picked up the translated pages. She put them inside her bag. She looked at Mateo. He was looking at Ronan. She watched his profile, the jaw, the eyes, the particular set of a man who is deciding something that does not have a clean answer. She had watched him make decisions for 7 years. This one was different. She could tell by the quality of the stillness. 19 years, Mateo said. Ronan looked up. "I want to understand one thing," Mateo said. "Not for the review, not for Ferrante. For me." He waited. "When did you stop being loyal?" Ronan's hands moved on the table. A small movement, a repositioning that was not quite restlessness and not quite comfort. "I didn't stop," he said. "That's the part you won't believe, but it's true. I was loyal to the organization. I was loyal to what your father built. I watched you inherit it, and I watched you—" He stopped. He chose his next word with care. "Diminish it. Not through cruelty, through inattention." Mateo said nothing. "The Miami trip. The Eastern waterfront deal you let lapse. The 3 council meetings in 6 months where you arrived having not read the operational reports. I watched you fall in love with a woman who was wrong for you and stop paying attention to everything else. And I thought—" Ronan pressed his mouth together. "I thought I was protecting something worth protecting. By dismantling it. By repositioning it under someone who would pay attention. You. Eventually." Ronan looked at the table. "Yes." Mateo was quiet for a long moment. Vivienne watched him absorb it. Not the betrayal, which he had absorbed in increments since Connecticut, but the specific texture of it, the variety of it that comes dressed as concern, the kind that gets close enough to look like love. "Get him out of here," Mateo said to Ferrante's man. And then he turned and walked to the door, and Vivienne followed him, and neither of them looked back. The sun was coming up. They were outside the compound on the east side, away from the main entrance, a strip of pavement between the building and a chain-link fence with a view of nothing remarkable. A service street, a gray sky doing something cautious with orange along the horizon's edge. A dumpster, a parked truck. The specific beauty of an ugly place at dawn. Mateo stood with his back against the building's exterior wall and tipped his head back and looked at the sky for a moment. He had his hands at his sides. The cut above his eyebrow had dried fully. He looked, she thought, like a man who has been awake for a long time and is beginning to feel the full weight of that, not collapsing under it, just feeling it honestly. She stood a few feet away. She still had the bag over her shoulder with the ledger inside. She was aware of her hand aching from the 3 hours of writing and of her ankle where it had turned getting off the porch roof, which had been manageable until now, but was beginning to make its objections known more specifically. She stood on it anyway. Lena Marek was recruited 16 months ago, she said. She's not... I want you to understand this, Matteo. She was not a woman who happened to catch your attention. She was a specific selection based on Ronan's 19 years of knowing your patterns. She was not saying this to wound him. She was saying it because she had spent 2 nights arriving at this understanding, and she needed him to have it fully. She didn't choose you. She was placed. He kept looking at the sky. I know. Knowing it and feeling it are different things. I know that too. He lowered his head. He looked at the pavement between them. It doesn't change what I did, that I was available to it, that I let myself become the kind of man who had stopped paying attention to what he had at home. He looked up at her. That part is mine. I'm not going to put it on Ronan. She held his look. No, she said. It is yours. He nodded. He accepted it with the directness of a man who has decided he is done managing his own accounting. The Empire, he said. The formal review. It's going to dismantle most of the operational structure. Ferrante and Marne will manage the transition, but there won't be a Vescari operation to come back to, not the way it was. I know. You knew that was the outcome when you put the documents on that table. Yes. And you still did it. She shifted her weight off the ankle that was complaining. I put the documents on the table because the alternative was letting Ronan complete what he started, and Ronan completing what he started meant your father being managed in a room somewhere until he said what Ronan needed him to say, and then... She stopped. And then whatever came next, which was not going to be better than this. He was quiet. Also, she said, I'm not going back to it. Whatever happens between you and me, I'm not going back to what that life was. So dismantling it is, from a certain angle, consistent with my interests. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. The kind of expression that arrives when something is both painful and precise. You're honest, he said. I'm always honest. You just didn't always hear it. He looked at her for a moment. No, he said. I didn't. The sun cleared the horizon line. The orange along the edge of the sky became something less tentative, and the service street lit up in the flat way that streets do when they're suddenly visible rather than implied. A pigeon landed on the dumpster, looked at them both with the aggressive disinterest of a city bird, and left. My father, Matteo said. When they bring him here, he doesn't need to be brought here. He needs to go back to the facility, a different one, somewhere Ronan has no connection to. He needs continuity of care. She adjusted the bag on her shoulder. I can help with that. I have contacts in the healthcare administration space from the Foundation's work. I can identify a placement that's appropriate and secure. He looked at her. You'd do that. He's an old man who doesn't fully know what was done around him and in his name. Yes, I'd do that. A long pause. The day was arriving fully now, the gray receding, the cold clarifying. She felt it on her face and on the back of her hands. What are you going to do? Matteo said. After. She thought about it. Not for the first time. She had thought about it in the cabin and in the car and in room 7 of the Cash Motel. But for the first time out loud, for the first time in the presence of another person, which gave it a different weight. The foundation, she said. The Cross Farrell Foundation. I'm going to build it into what I intended it to be before I was building it as an exit route. There's legitimate work to do. Legal aid, housing access, some workforce programs I've been developing on paper for 2 years. She looked at the sky. I'm going to do the work. The real work. With the legitimate capital I spent 7 years quietly positioning. She paused. And I'm going to be a woman with her own name again. Not Mrs. Vescari, not Matteo's wife. Vivienne Cross. He received that without flinching. Vivienne Cross, he said quietly, like he was hearing it for the first time and noting the difference. That was always the name, she said. I know. He straightened away from the wall. He reached into his jacket pocket, and she understood, before his hand came out, what was in it. She had understood it was coming since she'd noticed the ring was not on the nightstand when she went back to the penthouse. in her mind and mapped what she had left there. He had taken it. He put it on the space between them, not pressing it toward her, just setting it there, on a low concrete ledge between two sections of fencing in the early morning light. He looked at it. "I'm not asking you to come back," he said. "I understand that's not... I understand what I would be asking if I asked that, and I understand I don't have standing to ask it." He looked up at her. "But I need you to know something, not as a negotiation, not as a..." He pressed his mouth together, searching for the word that wasn't performing. "Not as strategy, just as a fact." She waited. "You spent 7 years protecting me from things I didn't know needed protecting. You built systems I didn't know existed. You carried information I should have been carrying myself. And I..." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I gave you a party and a ring and a name, and thought that was enough. I thought being Matteo Vescori's wife was a thing a woman would want to be, enough to make the rest of it worth it." He looked at the ring on the ledge. "I finally understand what I actually had. What I wasted." He said the last word like it cost him something. "I finally understand that." She looked at the ring. Small platinum band, 7-carat stone, the light catching it in a way that managed to be both beautiful and exhausting. She had worn it for 6 years. She had taken it off in 4 minutes and 30 seconds on a Tuesday night in October in a bedroom that smelled of his cologne. She picked it up. She held it in her palm for a moment. She felt the weight of it, actual physical weight, which she had forgotten, the specific density of that much compressed meaning in a small object. She looked at him. "I know you understand it," she said. "I can see that you do." She closed her hand around the ring. "But understanding something you lost is different from becoming the man you'd need to be to deserve another chance at it. You understand what I mean?" "Yes." "That's not a door I'm closing. It's a distinction I'm making." She looked at his face, the cut above his eyebrow, the fatigue he was wearing honestly, not managing. The specific expression of a man who is not negotiating but is simply standing in front of the consequences of himself and not moving away. "I'm not going to tell you where I'll be. I'm not going to give you a timeline. I'm not going to tell you what I need to see because I don't know yet what I need to see. I need to be Vivienne Cross for a while and find out what that is, separate from this." She gestured, a small motion that encompassed the compound and the service street and 7 years and the ring in her closed hand. "All of this." He nodded. Something in him settled. Not hope, not relief, but the acceptance of a man who has asked the right thing and received an honest answer and understands that is more than he had an hour ago. "Okay," he said. It was the smallest word she had heard him say in 7 years. It fit his mouth differently than his usual register. Not diminished, just genuine. She put the ring in her jacket pocket. She picked up her bag. She looked at him one more time, full look, not a glance, took in his face in the morning light, the older version of the man she had watched from a gallery doorway 11 years ago, when he had been laughing at something that caught her genuinely off guard, and she had thought, against her own better judgment, that one. Then she walked away. Not dramatically. She walked down the service street toward the corner where the Subaru was parked 2 blocks east, and her ankle voiced its objection at the uneven pavement, and she adjusted her gait and kept going. And she did not look back because looking back was a thing she had done enough of, and she was done with it as a general practice. 6 months later, the formal council review concluded its findings. Ronan Vale cooperated with the review, fully, in the end, in exchange for terms that Ferrante and Marne negotiated without Matteo's direct involvement. The Halcyon Meridian accounts were seized and redistributed to settle outstanding organizational debts. Lena Marek entered a cooperation agreement with federal authorities in a parallel proceeding that she had apparently been anticipating as a contingency since before the compound confrontation, which told Vivienne, when she heard about it through Helen Carrington's network, that she had been playing a longer game than even Ronan's, which was either impressive or clarifying, possibly both. Ennio Vescari was placed in a private care facility in New Hampshire, a small institution that specialized in memory care, with a staff that had been vetted by a physician Vivienne had personally selected, and a security arrangement that had nothing to do with the family's former operational structure. He had good days and bad days. On a good day in February, he told the attending nurse that his son had visited and that he was glad. The nurse noted it in the log. Matteo Vescari spent 3 months in the dissolution process, not fighting it, not performing injury, but moving through it with the specific pragmatism of a man who has decided that the cost of maintaining a thing is higher than the cost of releasing it. He sold the penthouse. He liquidated the holdings that could be liquidated cleanly. He cooperated through counsel with a federal inquiry that the mysterious voice from the Connecticut phone call had apparently been feeding for 11 months, and in cooperating he provided testimony that collapsed the Brooklyn organization's strategic tier in a way that was clean and complete, and that he understood was also, in some part, his penance. He moved to a smaller apartment on the Upper West Side. He started working, legitimate work, transitional work, the kind of thing that a man with his particular skill set could do in the private sector if he was willing to start from a position of not being Matteo Viscari specifically. He was willing. He found he was better at starting over than he had expected, which surprised him, and did not surprise people who had known him before the empire. He did not contact Vivienne. He had said he wouldn't. He didn't. Whatever he was becoming it without using her as a reference point, which was the only version of it that had any integrity, and he knew that, and he held to it with the same discipline he had once applied to things that were less worth the effort. The Cross-Farrell Foundation opened its expanded program in March. The office was in a building in Midtown that Vivienne had selected for its access, close to 3 subway lines, step-free entrance, a lobby that did not look like money because she had specifically not made it look like money because the people she needed to walk through that door should not have to feel like they were walking into money's house. She had renovated it herself, mostly. She had strong opinions about the layout, the light, the particular height of counters, and the positioning of chairs. Her staff, all 8 of them by March, had learned quickly that she had strong opinions about most operational things, and that her opinions were almost always correct, which made them easier to receive. She worked long hours. She had always worked long hours, but there was a different quality to it now. Not the hours of a woman maintaining a post, managing a position, standing adjacent to power while careful not to step in front of it. These were the hours of a woman building something that was entirely her own and that she could measure by whether it worked rather than by whether it was acceptable. She had her own name on the door. Vivienne Cross, Executive Director. She had looked at it for a full minute the day the sign was installed. Her assistant, a 26-year-old named Daria, who was practical and unsentimental, and who Vivienne liked tremendously, had stood beside her during that minute and then said, "You want coffee?" And Vivienne had said yes, and they had gone inside and started the day. She did not miss the penthouse. She missed some things, specific things, concrete things, the particular quality of the light in the bedroom in the early morning, the weight of a good coat that had been in a well-maintained closet for years, the specific ease of a life organized so thoroughly around another person's needs that your own needs had developed the habit of waiting quietly. She missed that ease the way you miss a bad habit, not with longing, but with a clear-eyed recognition of how comfortable a thing can be even when it's costing you something. She had lunch with Helen Carrington in April. They ate at a place in Chelsea that had good bread and no pretensions. Helen asked how she was doing. Vivienne said she was doing better than she had expected and worse than she would claim in mixed company, which Helen received with the dry appreciation of someone who preferred honesty to performance. "He hasn't called," Helen said. "I know." Vivienne pulled a piece of bread apart. "I'd know if he had." "Are you waiting?" Vivienne thought about it. She pulled the bread apart further. "I'm not waiting," she said, "but I'm not waiting either. I'm just—" She set the bread down. "I'm in the middle of something, and I don't know yet what it's going to look like when it's finished. That's not a waiting posture. It's just an honest one." Helen looked at her with the expression of a woman who understood the difference. "Fair," she said. They ate. They talked about the Foundation's spring program launch, about a legal challenge Helen's team was managing in a separate case, about a book they had both read and disagreed about in complementary ways. The lunch lasted 2 hours. Vivienne walked back to the office in the April light with her jacket open and her bag on her shoulder and the particular feeling of a person who has been somewhere honest and is carrying it forward. She was at her desk at 2 in the afternoon when Daria knocked and leaned in the doorway. "There's something at reception for you," Daria said. "I don't think you ordered it." Vivienne looked up. "What kind of something?" "The someone dropped it off kind." "No note." "Well, one word." Vivienne came out to the reception area. On the counter, in a plain paper bag, was a small rectangle wrapped in craft paper. She picked it up, turned it over. No label, no card, except a single folded piece of paper tucked under the string. She unfolded it. One word, handwritten. His handwriting. She knew it from 7 years of handwritten notes on operational documents, from the shorthand they had developed together, from the rare occasions when he wrote something personal rather than practical. The word was, whenever. She stood in the reception area of the Cross Farrell Foundation and held the piece of paper and understood what it meant. Not when you're ready, which would have been a question with an expected answer. Not I'm waiting, which would have been a claim on her time. Just whenever. An open coordinate. A man who had learned, at significant personal cost, not to put conditions on the things he wanted most. She set the paper down on the counter. She unwrapped the craft paper. Inside was a small framed photograph. Not one she recognized, not one from the penthouse, not a photograph she had ever seen before. It was a picture of a building in the early morning light, a low structure with a gravel driveway, birch trees along a road shoulder. The Foundation House in Connecticut, taken from the driveway. The angle of a man walking up toward the door, looking at the place his wife had spent 3 years preparing for the version of herself she was going to need to become. She had not known he had seen it that way. She had not known he had been looking at it as anything other than the address he'd been given. She held the photograph. Daria, behind her, said nothing. Daria was good at that. Vivienne stood at the reception counter of the foundation she had built and looked at the photograph of the house she had prepared and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that was not strategic and not tactical and not the product of analysis. Something she had been carrying below the level of calculation since a Tuesday night in October when she had sat on the edge of a bed and counted floor tiles. She put the photograph in the paper bag. She carried it back to her office. She set it on the desk. She sat down. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened the file on her desk, the spring program review, 40 pages, annotated in red, and she got back to work. The photograph stayed on the corner of the desk where she could see it without looking for it. The word whenever was in her pocket. She worked until 7 that evening. She turned off the office light. She locked the door. She walked out of the building and into the city that was doing what cities do at 7 in the evening. Noise, movement, the particular compression of 1 million private lives moving through the same public space. And she turned up her collar against the April wind and she walked, unhurried, toward something she had not yet named but could, for the first time, feel the shape of. It was not the life she had left. It was not the life she had survived. It was the one she was building, one day at a time, with her own hands and her own name, and the clear-eyed knowledge that she had been to the edge of herself and had come back